Putin is terrified of F-16s in Ukraine, and he should be. Since basically the beginning of the Russian invasion, Ukraine has been pleading with its Western supporters for advanced fighter jets. For most of the war, the US has been staunchly opposed to giving Ukraine these systems, as they could allow for strikes far behind Russian lines, escalating the conflict. But now officials in Kyiv might be finally getting their wish, in the form of US-made F-16s set to be delivered later this year. As of this video, the training for Ukrainian F-16 pilots has begun in Denmark, and is set to begin in multiple other NATO countries such as the Netherlands. Back at the annual G7 summit in May, with Ukraine's Zelensky as a special guest, US President Joe Biden announced that the US would conduct its own training for Ukrainian F-16 pilots, which it estimated could be completed in under a year, with basic training possibly taking only 4 months. But where might all these jets be coming from? How important are they to Ukraine? And perhaps most importantly, how could they change the outcome of this brutal and unpredictable war? Let's start with the question of where exactly the F-16s might be coming from. There are more than 2,200 F-16s around the world, making it the most popular combat aircraft in use today. But the most likely candidates seem to be jets recently retired by the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. These would likely be the F-16 AM/BM models, which were originally acquired in the 1980s and upgraded in the 1990s. All of these would therefore be aging aircraft with high mileage and old radar systems. But even with these drawbacks, the jet's software allows them to use some of the most modern and deadly weapons in the NATO arsenal, including the AIM-120 air-to-air missiles and stealthy long-range joint air-to-surface standoff missiles, or JASSMs. Reports suggest that the Netherlands in particular was closely involved in the effort to get Washington to approve the F-16 training, helping convince Biden of their need in Ukraine. Interestingly, however, the F-16s aren't coming from the US at all. This is probably partially due to the tensions with China, for which the Pentagon is keeping significant material in reserve in case an air or naval battle breaks out over the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. The other main reason is that US policymakers still worry that too aggressive or successful a strike by Ukraine could force Putin's hand in ways we'd all rather not think about. That was the rationale behind the strategy so far: give Ukraine as many surface-to-air and land capabilities as possible while avoiding the potential of an aerial strike inside Russian territory. But this logic has already been challenged by Ukraine's use of drones in so-called shaping operations in recent weeks, some of which have reached as far as Moscow. Because of this, the authorization for Ukraine to receive F-16s and the associated training has been a matter of tension in Washington for months. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and several others have objected to the idea, essentially claiming that there were too many unknowns and that Ukraine has done well enough without F-16s. So the approval for other countries to ship their F-16s to Ukraine is still a big change, overriding a key condition baked into their initial sale by the US, which prohibited European allies from sending them elsewhere. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was apparently one of the driving forces behind the administration's decision, as well as helping to convince European NATO allies to get on board. Yet even so, it's unclear when any of these countries will actually be supplying the F-16s in question. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark are working towards replacing their current F-16s with more advanced F-35s, but have all held back on actually committing to sending the old jets to Ukraine. Similarly, the UK has offered to provide flight training, but doesn't actually operate any F-16s itself. While this may start to change once the training is complete, there's currently a lot of hesitation from the West about pushing Putin just a little too far and ending up in some sort of nuclear standoff. Some countries like Belgium also worry about diminishing their own capabilities. Not that Belgium is a likely candidate to be invaded by anyone. Others, like Denmark, have stated that they will reconsider sending F-16s if others are also doing so, but that they won't go it alone. The Netherlands and Norway appear to be similarly torn, while other countries with F-16s not in the process of being phased out are much less likely to join in. In a nutshell, at the moment it's pretty clear that even those countries which have declared support for Ukraine's push for jets either can't or aren't willing to provide significant numbers of them in the short to medium term. Once Ukraine actually gets the aircraft, there's another set of problems it needs to deal with. Specifically, they must be able to operate, maintain, and sustain the F-16s, which is not the easiest task. For instance, a March 2023 study by the Congressional Research Service identified several crucial conditions necessary to successfully field the jets. The biggest concerns it identified concern the supply chain. This means acquiring sufficient spare parts, allocating funding for operations and support, implementing a maintenance inventory system, training maintainers, and acquiring an ongoing supply of weapons with which to arm their F-16s. These tasks are difficult enough for countries in peacetime, with previous experience and a wide base of technical knowledge. For Ukraine, they are likely to be even trickier. Of course, if the course of the war so far is anything to judge by, Ukrainians will continue to figure out inventive solutions to logistical issues facing their military. Russians, on the other hand, have no hope of obtaining advanced fighter jets and are stuck using obsolete human wave tactics while trying to avoid kicking off a civil war in their own country. But even accounting for the staggering incompetence of the Russian military, Ukraine certainly still faces some hurdles obtaining and operating even used F-16s. If they take to the skies without plans to support these aircraft, they will break down quickly and most likely become expensive stationary targets for Russian air-to-surface missiles. This is especially true for the F-16, which can require some 18 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. Basically, if they do things right and don't rush it, there's a strong possibility that Ukraine won't even be using the F-16s until the end of 2023. This also suggests that many defense experts believe the war will continue for quite some time, despite the incompetence of the Russian armed forces and short mutiny of the Wagner Group PMC. By greenlighting the transfer of the F-16s, the US is essentially admitting that the war will not stop anytime soon, and that Ukraine will need continual upgrades to its firepower in a long-term war of attrition. If Ukraine can get a handle on the jet's supply and maintenance, that's when the training will really start to become important. Like any complex weapon system, the F-16 was designed to fill a particular set of roles in an existing military structure and support certain doctrines of modern warfare. To get the most out of them, the Ukrainians will need to adopt more of the practices and techniques which the plane's design caters to. Fundamentally, the F-16 was designed to help the US Air Force beat the Russian Air Force in aerial combat. Logic follows that the more the Ukrainians can fly them like the US Air Force would, the better the results will be. Of course, other NATO countries have adopted similar practices, but most of these are also quite different from the ways Ukraine has been fielding their existing fighter jets. For one thing, the F-16 was essentially designed to be a lightweight, multi-role fighter capable of doing many different missions well, but not to be the best at any of them. F-16s were definitely not intended to be operated from improvised airfields as Ukraine has been doing with many of its current aircraft. They can be especially susceptible to getting debris caught in their engines, a great way to crash before ever engaging in combat. This brings up the issue of where Ukraine would put the 200 F-16s it's asking for. Rand Corporation analysts John Hone and William Courtney recently assessed that F-16s do best on long, pristine runways. They could face difficulties on the rougher, former Soviet ones dispersed across Ukraine. To bring in Western aircraft, Ukraine might need to repave and potentially extend a number of runways, a process which Russia would likely detect. If only a few airfields were suitable and in known locations, focused Russian attacks could impede Ukrainian F-16s from flying. This is mostly because, idiotic and unprepared as most of Russia's military might be, they still have access to some pretty advanced technology. This is especially true when it comes to air-to-air combat. Modern Russian air fighters such as the MiG-31 and Su-35 can see quite far with their powerful modern radars. They also have R-37 missiles that have a longer range than NATO-supplied AIM-120 AMRAAMs, or advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles. In other words, Russian aircraft can potentially spot Ukrainian F-16s and shoot them down before the Ukrainian pilots see them coming. Some of this has already happened with Ukraine's current fleet of Su-27 and MiG-29 fighters, and the improved capabilities of the F-16 are not enough to change this dynamic. Because of the reach of these Russian fighters, Ukrainian fighter pilots often break off missions early or operate far behind their own front lines. F-16s would operate with the same constraints, limiting their ability to perform air-to-surface missions with relatively short-range weapons like the JDAM bomb guidance kits. Because of this, even once Ukraine receives F-16s, it will still most likely have to rely on drones and other current air platforms for support. There's also the question of how to get the proper armaments Ukraine needs to pair with the F-16s. The best way for Ukraine to capitalize on any F-16s it receives will be advanced Western armaments which can stand up to Russian firepower. The issue, like everything else in a war, these can be staggeringly expensive. For instance, a single AMRAAM costs about $1.2 million, while it takes about 2 years to make one. The US could always provide existing weapons like the AMRAAM from its own stockpiles, but that could leave them depleted in the event of an unexpected conflict, a risk the Pentagon is not willing to take. However, the real tactical and logistical advantages that F-16s would provide to Ukraine are long-term. A major benefit is that it will be easier for Ukraine to maintain aircraft whose parts are supplied by the United States and NATO than their current, outdated aircraft manufactured by Russia. In turn, this could also make it easier for Ukraine to integrate their air force into NATO sometime in the future. And the more Ukraine's arsenal is compatible with NATO's, the better they'll fare, and the worse off Putin will find himself. For instance, Ukraine was previously given AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARM, to use against ground-based radar systems. As with much of their current military arsenal, they managed to attach the system onto their MiG-29s, but the end result was far from ideal, since Soviet-era fighters were not designed to fire US-manufactured missiles. F-16s with modern software will enable Ukraine to employ HARMs and other modern weapon systems much more effectively. This includes missiles such as the AIM-9 Sidewinder and the AIM-120, which the United States and NATO are likely to provide, will be useful for Ukraine's defense against Russian cruise missiles like the Kh-101 and the Kh-555, and against Iranian-made Shahed kamikaze drones. Ukraine's stockpiles of Soviet S-300 surface-to-air missiles are running out pretty quickly, and there are only so many Patriot missiles available. So even if Russia will still have some superior jets, the F-16's air-to-air capability will definitely help those ground-based defenses last longer, and it's pretty clear that this is necessary. Western military analysts have estimated that Ukraine's combined fleet belonging to air and ground forces has been depleted by more than a third since the Russian invasion began. Ukraine has lost at least 60 of its 145 fixed-wing planes and 32 of 139 helicopters, according to classified US military information leaked on the social media platform Discord in recent months. The Ukrainian Air Force rarely reveals numbers regarding its fleet or other details of tactical importance, including incidents of planes shot down or otherwise destroyed, but officials have acknowledged losses from the more than a year of war, as well as difficulties with the repair and replacement of damaged planes. Another big question is whether the United States will supply powerful JASSMs to use with the F-16s. These deadly, low-detection cruise missiles are incredibly long-range and have a 1,000-pound armor-piercing warhead. It also seems there's a good chance of this happening. Britain has provided the Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles, and Ukraine has already put them to use. Storm Shadow is generally similar to the baseline version of JASSM in terms of size, range, employment, and observability, so providing JASSMs would not necessarily be an escalation. F-16s utilizing JASSMs could allow for Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov's stated long-term plan to retake Crimea without a fight. Carrying out such a plan would require cutting off Russian troops in Crimea from their supply lines via the Kerch Strait Bridge, ports like Sevastopol, and the land route from the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. JASSMs could give Ukraine the ability to fire on and destroy logistic hubs like naval bases, ammunition depots, bridges, and command and control facilities deep within Crimea. It could also serve as an alternative to the surface-to-air ATACMS missile, which Ukraine has requested but not yet received. The United States has quite a few more JASSMs than ATACMS, so it might be willing to supply them to augment Ukraine's current arsenal of Storm Shadows. Another area F-16s could be helpful to Ukraine is as a good old-fashioned deterrent. While Putin clearly has no desire for the war to end, he was recently forced to replace General Sergei Surovikin due to his involvement in the Wagner Group's attempted coup against Putin himself. Surovikin was widely known as one of Russia's most trigger-happy commanders, willing to launch indiscriminate attacks against the civilian population of Ukraine. But whoever he gets replaced with may be less gung-ho about ordering air and drone strikes on Kyiv, especially if Ukraine has 200 F-16s with which to respond. While there's little chance that Russian attacks will stop in the east, Ukraine having advanced fighter jets may give it enough of an edge in the air that attacks in the west of the country are diminished. The fact that Ukrainian jets and helicopters have been forced to attack cautiously for the entire war means that F-16s and their longer-range weaponry could prove very useful here. Ukrainian pilots have developed a tactic of flying low, unleashing unguided rockets from Ukrainian territory, then immediately backing away to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Russian aircraft use similar tactics but have the advantage of superior firepower, which allows them to fire rockets and gliding bombs from a greater distance. A recent report from the Royal United Services Institute assessed that because of these tactics, even a small number of Western fighters could have a major deterrent effect. While F-16s likely will not grant Ukraine air superiority, they will make the defense of the country's airspace easier, and if paired with JASSMs or similar weapons, provide an important means of launching the type of long-range weapons which are likely necessary to force Russia out of Crimea and other fortified areas. A group of Ukrainian parliament members speaking at the German Marshall Fund in Washington in April said they wanted the F-16 because its radar can locate targets on the ground hundreds of miles away, allowing pilots to stay safely over Ukrainian-held territory while launching weapons into Russian-occupied areas. In addition to defense and deterrence, this also suggests that F-16s could feature in the later stages of the counteroffensive currently underway, which could take the entire rest of the year. Colonel Yuri Inat, a spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force, seemed to confirm this, telling the New York Times that F-16s could provide cover for Ukrainian troops trying to advance and hold formerly occupied areas. He noted that it could also be used to cut off Russian planes that have started launching guided missiles more than 30 miles from the Ukrainian front line, to defend the sea route that lets Ukrainian grain leave the country and to push further into the Russian-occupied oblasts. All of this helps explain why the Kremlin seems so nervous about the possibility of F-16s in Ukrainian hands. When it became clear that the US would greenlight their training and eventual transfer, Russian diplomats had a minor meltdown. First, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov said any transfer of the US jets to Ukraine would be pointless, since Russia's capabilities are more than enough to end the special military operation whenever they want. Now, by this point, we probably don't need to tell you that that's pure BS. When that was pointed out, Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, went on to claim that even if the F-16s were transferred, they couldn't possibly be effective, since Ukraine lacks the proper infrastructure, pilots, and maintenance personnel. While this is slightly more true, given the country's incredible adaptability so far, there's no reason to think that Ukraine can't make F-16s work, given the right amount of time and training. The Kremlin knows this, and it seems to be making their threats increasingly desperate. When the statements by Antonov and Rybakov failed to scare NATO or the US, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov took the stage during a speech at a military conference in Tajikistan. He claimed that we must keep in mind that one of the modifications of the F-16 can accommodate nuclear weapons. If they do not understand this, then they are worthless as military strategists and planners. This is obviously pretty ironic considering Russia's continual failures in military planning for the last year, but also shows a deep-seated worry from top officials. They likely don't think that the US would ever give Ukraine nuclear warheads, but know that even if F-16s do not change the battle space in the short term, they will bring Ukraine closer to the West and increase the country's military resilience. The West's response to these threats was also summed up pretty well in the reply to Lavrov by Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby that if you're worried about Ukrainian military capabilities, then you should take your troops and leave Ukraine. This back and forth over F-16s highlights a larger trend in the war, that Ukraine's warfighting increasingly looks like that of the West, rather than a former Soviet satellite state. Because Russia failed so badly to understand the depth of Ukrainian resolve, every step Putin and his cronies take pushes Ukraine towards NATO, the EU, and the US. By the end of the war, whenever that might come, Ukraine will have extremely close military, economic, and political ties to Europe and America. The F-16s are just the latest part of this broader shift, but the fact that their transfer has been approved is another sign that the Ukraine of 2021 is not the same as the one we see today. War has transformed the country into a major regional military power, with advanced equipment and some of Europe's most battle-hardened troops. Even though Putin somehow hasn't learned his lesson yet, there's no doubt that Ukraine will play a major role in the future of European security. But what do you think? What does the transfer of F-16s to Ukraine mean for the future of the conflict? And will it be enough to overcome Russia's military? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Throughout the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict, neither side has managed to exert air superiority. Despite Russia's larger fleet, Ukraine's clever use of air and anti-air defenses, supercharged by NATO-supplied weapons, has kept Russian planes at bay. But the game could change. Late in 2023, the US made a pivotal move by agreeing to send F-16s to Ukraine, making a first in Ukrainian aviation history. Could these jets tip the scales, offering Ukraine a chance to claim the skies? The F-16, though not the newest kid on the block, is no slouch. As a versatile, late fourth-generation fighter, it's not just about achieving air superiority, it's about providing a flexible option for both attack and defense. Thanks to its all-round capabilities, the F-16 has secured its spot as a mainstay in the fleets of numerous countries and stands as a pillar among NATO forces, outpacing older Soviet and Chinese models. Could the introduction of the F-16s into Ukraine's arsenal rewrite the aerial warfare playbook? Let's explore what these jets bring to the high-stakes aerial duel. When it comes to the supposed efficiency of the F-16s, it's important to compare them to the powerhouse of the Russian and Ukrainian air forces, the Su-27. From a technical standpoint, both F-16s and Su-27s belong to the fourth generation of combat aircraft, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. The Su-27 was designed to be an air-to-air dogfighting and air superiority aircraft. It's fast and efficient at taking out enemy air forces. With a top airspeed of about 160 miles per hour more than the F-16, an Su-27 can outmaneuver other similar aircraft in close-range combat. Keep in mind that the Su-27s that Russia and Ukraine use are technically not the same aircraft. Both Russia and Ukraine inherited their fleets of Su-27s from the Soviet era, yet Russia has since enhanced its aircraft with significant upgrades. Moreover, Russia's arsenal includes the advanced Su-35s, giving it a broader range of modern aerial capabilities. Despite these challenges, Ukraine has shown resilience and adaptability with its available Soviet-era aircraft. In 2022, Ukraine faced tough losses, with 62 aircraft down during combat missions. Given that Ukraine's Air Force comprises about 80 fourth-generation MiG-29 and Su-27s, these losses impacted the number of operations conducted in 2023. Remarkably, the losses were reduced to 7 aircraft in that year, underscoring the Air Force's strategic adjustments and efforts to preserve its fleet. This reduction in losses highlights Ukraine's capability to adapt and continue its aerial defense efforts, despite having lost approximately 40% of its air power. Ukraine's Air Force relies on its existing fleet and international support, as the country does not currently produce new aircraft. This reliance on older models and the challenge of securing spare parts for maintenance are significant hurdles. However, the potential integration of Western aircraft like the F-16 into Ukraine's arsenal could open new avenues for enhancing its aerial capabilities, offering hope for bolstering Ukraine's defensive and offensive air strategies. Still, the reliance on already obsolete aircraft has turned the Russo-Ukrainian battle into a prolonged war of attrition. In light of the heavy losses accrued during 2022, Ukrainian tactics have shifted from aerial attacks on Russian soil to mid-range operations to take out key pieces of the Russian army infrastructure and command. The tactic is bolstered by the fact that Ukraine has already received plenty of ground-to-air missiles and weaponry, allowing its army to support air operations with anti-air defenses. Ukrainian aircraft therefore can launch a hit-and-run attack on Russian forces and duck behind the heavy Ukrainian air defenses, making the operations less likely to result in the loss of aircraft. But this air battle isn't straightforward. Russia does possess a bigger fleet with around 100 Su-27s and an additional 130 of the more advanced Su-35s, and Russian radars spotting targets from 100 miles away outrange Ukraine's 55-mile reach, letting them spot and counter threats, including drones and missiles, sooner. Their R-77 missiles can hit targets from 80 miles out, a capability Ukraine lacks, putting Ukrainian jets at risk before they even know what hit them. But despite these advantages, the fight for air dominance remains at a deadlock. Russia doesn't have enough concentrated long-range capabilities to take out NATO-provided air defenses. Similarly, Ukrainian planes don't have the range to reach further out from the same defenses and strike key Russian infrastructure and military hardware to make a meaningful advance. That's where the F-16 aims to completely overturn the tide of battle. F-16s have a more powerful radar system, which has a range of over 110 miles in its most potent version. This gives the jet a significant edge over Russia's improved Su-27s in target acquisition and tactics. Additionally, getting F-16s also means that Ukraine will gain access to modern missiles that are compatible with the plane's mechanisms. Most notably, this includes the AIM-120 AMRAAM, which is one of the most versatile and destructive missiles in active use. AIM-120s have a range of 65 to 100 miles and have gained a fearsome reputation due to their use in various wars during the 21st century. It's one of the hallmarks of America's ongoing air supremacy, and its capability to lock onto and track a target fills a hole in Ukraine's arsenal. The missiles easily outgun Russia's R-77s, which will allow Ukraine to penetrate deeper into occupied territory or Crimea and even strike at targets on the Russian mainland. The active radar system inside the R-77s and AIM-120s also means pilots won't have to maintain a lock onto their targets. The system slots perfectly into Ukraine's existing hit-and-run tactics, meaning that pilots can combine their experience with modernized ordnance and planes to gain an advantage. Giving Ukraine F-16s and AIM-120s will provide stability against Russia and maintain control over its airspace. One of the key factors that makes F-16s considerably more powerful than their Soviet counterparts is their general reliability. F-16s have an expected lifespan of between 3,500 and 4,500 flight hours. Accordingly, their components are generally expected to last for that period, and the airplane can remain in service with minor repairs and maintenance. After that, the mechanical parts have a much higher chance of breaking down due to wear and tear, and the wiring might fray and damage important electrical components. By contrast, older Soviet MiGs and Sukhois only have an expected lifespan in the range of 2,000 to 3,500 hours. Similarly to how Ukraine had to reduce flight operations between 2022 and 23 to counter airplane loss, Russia has also had to moderate its Air Force use. The oldest aircraft that Russia has used, MiG-29s and Su-27s, are much closer to the end of their lifespan. Furthermore, since Russia needs to mount an offensive, its planes typically have to fly in from farther bases, making each operation more demanding on Russian aircraft than Ukrainian aircraft. In fact, the prolonged nature of the war between Russia and Ukraine has also brought about a major concept in maintaining air superiority called imputed losses. The concept refers to the fact that the military will lose some of its key equipment or weaponry not due to enemy fire, but to parts breaking down from wear and tear. According to estimates by the RAND Corporation, Russia has lost between 30 and 60 aircraft solely to imputed losses over the last 2 years. If we take the average value, around 45 planes have been grounded because their parts can no longer operate. Russia has needed to fly their planes more frequently and push them to their limits, but it doesn't have enough manufacturing capacity to offset those losses. Based on RAND's report, Russia can produce between 18 and 36 modern aircraft per year, and it's assumed that it will need to cut down its Air Force operating capacity further to maintain its existing fleet. Since the country is still midway through replacing old Soviet-era planes with Su-35s, it's possible that they will prioritize using Su-27s. The main reason being that it will become prohibitively expensive to maintain a fleet of Su-27s. Russia might consider putting them up as sacrificial lambs in combat to allow more modern aircraft a better chance of survival. This means that Ukraine is more likely to see Su-27s and other fourth-generation aircraft used against them over the course of the war. With many reports suggesting that Russia doesn't have a concrete plan of pushing into Ukraine for the rest of 2024, it's possible that this would be Ukraine's time to push back on Russia's encroachment into their airspace. And that's where the newly donated F-16s could prove pivotal. These planes are coming from Denmark, around 25 aircraft, and the Netherlands, roughly 52 aircraft. The planes are likely relatively well preserved since the countries involved haven't needed to use their air force to a great extent over the past 20 years. With F-16s being a more competitive aircraft model, Russia will have no choice but to activate more of its air force to compensate. This will lead to further use of both modern and obsolete aircraft in the VKS, the Russian Aerospace Forces, increasing how often they perform sorties to counteract the F-16's improved radar detection and targeting range and avoid infrastructural losses. As a result, the increased aircraft usage will compound the imputed losses that the force will suffer throughout the war. Therefore, Russia might actively lose whatever advantage it has managed to hold onto for the last 2 years. Ukraine might even be able to take back contested areas, or at least manage to maintain air superiority over them. This will allow them to mount a concerted counter-offensive should the Russians ever falter on any front. Finally, if F-16s give Ukraine control over its airspace, they can be used to make offensive strikes deeper into Russian territory, taking out key artillery pieces that make ground combat more favorable for the Ukrainian forces. These victories in Ukrainian airspace could also prove fantastic for improving morale in the Ukrainian army. The soldiers have already managed to stave off the invasion with incredibly limited access to newer technology and being heavily outnumbered. With the addition of more advanced and reliable aircraft, they could push the Russians further out of Ukraine. But if the F-16s would have made so much difference for the Ukrainian forces, why have deliveries only started in late 2023? The answer to that hinges on the volatile state of global geopolitics. Over the past few years, Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has issued statements suggesting that the US delivering F-16s to Ukraine would be seen as a direct threat to Russia. This stems from the fact that F-16s technically have the capacity to carry nuclear warheads instead of traditional missiles, at least according to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Some have speculated that Russia will be willing to push the nuclear button on what it perceives to be grave transgressions against the country's efforts in Eastern Europe. This could plunge the entire world into a war, with many sides accruing significant losses as nuclear weapons are dispatched by all countries who own them. It should be noted that this is a similar strategy Putin has exercised in the past, even at the beginning of the invasion after it was clear that Ukraine wouldn't fall in 10 days. However, if the US took a chance and gave Ukraine F-16s at the start of the 2022 conflict, there's no telling whether Russia would follow through with that threat. But in recent years, Russia has pretty much exhausted its diplomatic options. With the Western countries becoming independent from Russia's oil and gas, Putin was forced to turn to China and India and other smaller trading partners to compensate for the income loss. However, that means that Russia has lost the upper hand in many negotiations and is currently positioning itself as a minor trading partner for China. As a result, leaders in the US and NATO were likely considering that the threats from Russia were empty and decided that they wouldn't lose too much and decided that they wouldn't lose much if they donated F-16s to Ukraine. Additionally, Russia's repeated attacks on civilian infrastructure has seen an increase in public support for Ukraine and may have encouraged the US to act faster to help shorten the war. The versatility of F-16s to carry both air-to-ground and air-to-air missiles means that they can be used to take down enemy drones and ordnance conducting strikes on civilian targets. Russia's situation is further complicated by the fact that its main ally throughout this war, China, seems to have gone silent on the matter. Considering China's goals to reduce American influence in the Indo-Pacific, it may be preparing to go to war with either the US or Russia to expand its claims and obtain more resources. That puts Russia in a hard situation where they won't have the backing of the world's second superpower should they make an impulsive decision. With the arrival of the F-16s, Ukraine will get a sizable boost in firepower. This comes in the form of advanced missile guidance systems that the planes can carry. While Ukraine already has access to some of the latest missiles available, such as the Storm Shadows, their capabilities were stunted by the fact that the MiG-29 and Su-27 weren't native platforms that can carry and guide them. The Ukrainian army had to cobble together makeshift carrying systems that could take these missiles into the air and launch them at the enemy. However, their range and accuracy took a hit, and their usefulness as precision strike missiles were largely nullified. With the addition of the F-16s, though, the army can now make full use of advanced weaponry to close the gap between Russia's numerical and technological superiority. Apart from the Storm Shadows, one potential game-changer associated with the F-16 donation is the AGM-88 HARM missile. This is an anti-radar missile that eradicates enemy positioning systems, thereby disabling them from launching long-range precision strikes. With these capabilities in Ukraine's possession, Russia will need to position its key artillery infrastructure closer to the border or withdraw it entirely. Furthermore, this strategic repositioning will also play to Ukraine's advantage. Due to the F-16's longer radar range and long-range capabilities, Ukraine will be able to exert more pressure on Russia's artillery, allowing it to eliminate Russia's long-range support equipment. What the F-16 will also bring to the table is improved mission control and tactical information access. Su-27s still rely on analog interfaces and gauges to display relevant information. However, since each display is limited to one piece or type of data, the cockpit of an Su-27 is loaded with displays and knobs, creating an information overload for the pilot. On the other hand, F-16s have integrated digital display systems. The digital screen allows the pilot to switch between different viewing modes and information panels. Apart from reducing visual clutter, the digital display has a much higher fidelity and responsiveness. All information that a pilot needs to consider at any given time can be accessed with a switch. However, the F-16 isn't the perfect solution for the Ukrainian military just yet. One of the most critical hurdles that need to be overcome is the lack of experienced pilots who can effectively navigate the F-16's modern systems. Since the Ukrainian Airforce so far has had no direct contact with F-16s, its pilots have never been trained on its modules. According to some estimates, it would take between 4 and 6 months to retrain a pilot from an Su-27 to an F-16. This is further complicated by the fact that most Ukrainian soldiers aren't proficient in English. While this might not seem significant, it's important to remember that training manuals and manufacturing manuals are rarely translated into languages as uncommon as Ukrainian, which is spoken as a main language only in Ukraine itself. This means that the US or another NATO country would need to partake in a monumental task of translating all manuals to Ukrainian while ensuring they are consistent and logical. Since this wasn't seen as a priority at the time, another option is to teach Ukrainian pilots English to a sufficient level. Even the few Ukrainian pilots who are proficient in English and can start training immediately need between 2 and 4 months before they would be combat ready. Additionally, F-16s require a different military airport strip setup. Soviet planes from the 20th century were designed to be operated from remote areas, with minimal ground control support and short takeoff and landing strips. By contrast, the F-16 has a lengthier takeoff procedure. MiG-29 and Su-27 planes have built-in ruggedness that ensures that the planes can endure adverse takeoff conditions, which the F-16 isn't particularly built for. For example, there have been videos of MiG planes being able to take off from regular civilian roads, something that's pretty much unthinkable for more modern aircraft. As a result, Ukraine will have a much more limited number of military airfields that can be used to field and deploy F-16s from the country. Due to the more elaborate logistical planning and reduced options, Russia might have an easier time spotting and monitoring airstrips that are used to deploy F-16s into the fray. To reduce the risks, Ukraine's best option is to field its F-16s in the western portions of the country, which are the furthest from the Russian front. However, this reduces the effective range of the jets, which would reduce their combat prowess. This is further compounded by the fact that F-16s actually have a lower travel range than Su-27s. While their fuel tanks are almost 4 times larger, the newer airplane chugs through fuel much quicker. A purely defensive position on the opposite side from the front would be economically inefficient, making the Ukrainian army much more reliant on fuel import than usual. Finally, F-16s are much more difficult to maintain than older Soviet aircraft. According to some estimates, the Su-27 requires 11 hours of maintenance for each flight hour, while an F-16 needs 17 hours for the same flight time. Additionally, Ukraine will be hard-pressed to adequately train its ground crews to maintain the craft. NATO countries can contract out ground crews, but that still poses a risk of having foreign civilians in a warring country. Regardless of the challenges involved in the process of integrating F-16s into the Ukrainian Air Force, the West remains cautious about donating these aircraft. While a big reason for that is the general unwillingness to let the war prolong even further, Western countries are also heavily incentivized to do so. The F-16s donated to Ukraine won't be brand new aircraft just out of the factories. All planes going to Ukraine will be older vehicles that haven't seen much combat and real use, but that are becoming obsolete and replaced with newer designs. By donating the F-16s to Ukraine, NATO countries can offload the cost of decommissioning the airplanes and their surrounding equipment and support. It might not seem like much, but removing a jet from active duty requires a significant logistical effort, which takes time and money to implement. By offloading those planes to Ukraine, the US, Denmark, and the Netherlands can save some of that money and provide much-needed political and military support to the country. It also showcases to the world that the West stays united with Ukraine in their fight against Russia. Despite these challenges, the F-16s should start seeing active use in Ukraine by the second quarter of 2024, with delivery orders being fulfilled until 2025 if the war continues. While Russia remains undeterred by the progress of Ukrainian aerial forces, Ukraine is well on its way to implementing training programs to use the aircraft to their fullest. With this injection of firepower, Ukraine will gain renewed hope of prolonging and turning the tide of the war. While the bulk of Russia's air supremacy comes from a larger fleet, F-16s will allow Ukraine to get up to speed technologically with the modernized Su-27s and even be able to go toe-to-toe with the Su-35s. And even though the F-16s are by now considered obsolete compared to the modern F-35s, they can still have a few final hurrahs in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Despite the fact Ukraine might not be able to field them for another few months, the army has shown considerable enthusiasm into making full use of these aircraft. With that, the F-16 will be remembered as another high point in the history of 20th century military aircraft design. How do you think the fight between Ukraine's F-16s and Russia's Su-27s and Su-35s will play out? Will the aircraft be enough to give Ukraine a better fighting chance, or do you think it's a case of too little, too late, and that the jets should have been deployed at the start of the conflict? Let us know in the comment section. Now go and check out how the F-35 could achieve air dominance in Ukraine within 24 hours. Or click this other video instead. In January 2024, NATO kicked off Steadfast Defender 2024, an exercise so massive it's been dubbed the biggest military shuffle since the legendary Cold War Reforger maneuvers of 1988. This isn't just any routine drill, it's a historical behemoth marking NATO's grandest display in the post-Cold War era. With new members on board and tensions in Europe simmering, this exercise has all the ingredients of a high-stakes military drama. For the first time, Sweden flexed its muscles alongside NATO powers as a fully fledged member, expanding the scope and intensity of the alliance's maneuvers. But as you might guess, not everyone's throwing a party over this. Putin has been eyeing these developments with more than a little unease. In today's video, we're diving deep into Steadfast Defender 2024. We'll break down the nuts and bolts of the exercises, explore Russia's chilly reception, and unpack the strategic moves that have led NATO to ramp up its game. Buckle up, it's going to be an intriguing ride through modern military history. Let's get started with a quick overview. Steadfast Defender began on January 22nd and will end on May 31st. It involves all 32 NATO countries, including Sweden, which formally joined the alliance as the operation was underway. 90,000 troops will take part in this drill, which will span the entirety of NATO's territory from North America to the Russian border. General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, stated that Steadfast Defender would be a demonstration of the alliance's ability to reinforce the entire Euro-Atlantic area, including through transatlantic movements of forces to counter the threat of a near-peer adversary. In other words, this exercise would simulate a combined response to a Russian attack on a NATO country, almost certainly in Eastern Europe. Poland, the Baltic, Germany, Norway, and Romania are therefore major areas for the exercise's operations, as all of these places are considered vulnerable to a Russian attack. In outlining the overall goal of the operation, Cavoli stated, "Exercise Steadfast Defender 2024 will be a clear demonstration of our unity, our strength, and our determination to protect each other, to protect our values and the rules-based international order." American units participating in the Steadfast Defender exercise include the U.S. Second Fleet, Green Berets, and Marines. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, over 50 total naval assets are taking part in Steadfast Defender, along with more than 1,100 combat vehicles. These vehicles include over 150 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, and 400 armored personnel carriers. Aircraft included are F-35s, FA-18s, F-15s, and Harrier jets and helicopters. 20,000 troops from the United Kingdom are also among the participants. 16,000 of these are from the British Army, with much of the activity coming from the 7th Light Mechanized Brigade Combat Team, which has taken its tanks, artillery, and helicopters with it. Other British Army units in Steadfast Defender 2024 include the Commando Helicopter Force, 16th Air Assault Brigade, and 16th Armored Brigade Combat Team. 2,000 sailors and 400 Royal Marines from the Royal Navy are participating as well. A British carrier strike group centered on one of the two Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers and its assortment of F-35B fighters is taking part in exercises in the North Atlantic, North Sea, and the Baltic. 15,000 of the troops in Steadfast Defender are from Poland, 10,000 are from Germany, an additional 5,000 are Dutch. The Steadfast Defender exercises are meant to be the first large-scale test of NATO's new defense plans that were approved at the Alliance's summit in Vilnius this year. According to NATO, Steadfast Defender 2024 is based on a fictitious Article 5 scenario triggered by a fictitious attack against the Alliance launched by a near-peer adversary. The Alliance's official website has detailed a timeline that offers an overview of all the sub-exercises in Steadfast Defender and their purposes. According to NATO, the first part of Steadfast Defender is focused on securing the Atlantic up to the Arctic. Live maritime exercises and amphibious assault drills are a big focus for this phase. The second part of Steadfast Defender is focused on moving troops through Europe. Troops and equipment will be deployed rapidly across national borders as part of this phase. The exercise began on January 22nd in Norfolk, Virginia. That city hosts NATO's Joint Command Force Norfolk, which is coordinating the first phase. American forces would be departing from there on that date, while Canadian forces would set off from Nova Scotia soon afterward. Between February 11th and 20th, NATO conducted maritime live exercises to test its ability to secure lines of reinforcement and communication across the Atlantic. According to the Alliance, these drills, called MARCOM-LIVEX, were conducted primarily off the Spanish coast. The next set of exercises, called Brilliant Jump, took place between February 12th and 28th. These tested the NATO response force's ability to plan and execute rapid deployments, including standby readiness during peacetime. These exercises were based in Germany and Poland. Then came Joint Warrior, led by the United Kingdom, where it primarily took place between February 24th and March 3rd. These drills emphasized maritime and offshore maneuvers in conjunction with air and land operations. Exercise Dragon 24 came between February 25th and March 14th. This one was led by Poland as part of a unilateral effort to train all branches of its armed forces to respond to crises. About 20,000 total troops from 10 NATO countries participated in Dragon 24. All of the 15,000 Polish troops in Steadfast Defender took part in the exercise. Sabre Strike 24 just started in April 2024 and is being led by US Army Europe and Africa. This set of exercises is also part of Part 2 and takes place from April 8th to 30th in Germany, Poland, and Lithuania, and it's putting emphasis on rapid deployment and cold weather training in the Baltic area. From February 29th to March 14th, NATO troops participated in Trojan Footprint 24, a drill that focused on improving the integration and interoperability of member states' respective special operations forces. Bulgaria, Georgia, Germany, Greece, North Macedonia, and Romania were the main host countries for this drill. About 2,000 special operations troops from Albania, Bulgaria, France, Georgia, Greece, Italy, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Portugal, Romania, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States participated in the exercise. The United States contributed about 900 of those troops. The Green Berets were known to participate in airborne operations alongside Greek paratroopers as part of the exercise. The Trojan Footprint exercise has occurred annually since 2002. The Crystal Arrow set of exercises took place between March 4th and 15th. Latvia was the host country for these drills, and the Latvian Mechanized Infantry Brigade led them. The purpose was to practice alert procedures and evaluate the readiness of NATO's multinational battle group Latvia. The Nordic response drills occurred between March 3rd and 14th. As the name implies, the purpose of this drill was to increase NATO's ability to address challenges in the extreme north. Finland and Sweden's entry into the alliance expanded these exercises. This drill involved over 20,000 troops, 50 ships, and 110 aircraft from 14 NATO countries. The next on NATO's list is Defender 24, scheduled for the span of April 8th to May 31st, and organized by the United States European Command. This exercise involves deployment of forces over distances stretching from North America to US EUCOM's area of responsibility, with Northern Europe as the primary focus point. Defender 24 tests NATO's ability to receive, stage, and deploy these forces in Europe. Defender 24 is the foundation for other exercises like Sabre Strike 24, Immediate Response 24, and Swift Response 24. Immediate response will occur between April 21st and May 31st. The United States will lead this exercise that's designed to boost the interoperability of NATO countries. The Hungarians will lead the Brave Warrior exercises between May 1st and 22nd and will include all forces in NATO's multinational battle group Hungary. Its purpose is to increase the training for this battle group to lead international operations and plan and conduct defensive operations. Spring Storm will take place in Estonia between May 12th and 31st. It's that country's largest annual military drill and will be led by one of the Estonian Defense Forces infantry divisions. It will focus on joint defensive operations with other NATO units. The aforementioned Swift Response 24 will occur between May 14th and June 14th, therefore going over the time technically allotted to the broader Steadfast Defender exercise. The United States will lead this drill and focus on joint airborne operations. Poland, the Baltic states, and Georgia will be the primary staging grounds. Finally, there is the German-led Grand Quadriga exercise, set to take place between April 30th and July 30th, running well over the allotted time for Steadfast Defender. Germany and Lithuania will be the primary staging grounds. The Grand Quadriga drills will focus on deterrence and NATO's defense posture. Taken together, we see that the Steadfast Defender 2024 exercise will simulate multiple types of combat across the entirety of NATO's territory, implying that it will test the alliance's ability to fight a war across a broad front resembling the World Wars. Though NATO made carefully worded statements to stress that Steadfast Defender was not directed against any country, Russia is the only one that fits the bill of being able to create the scenario the alliance was training to counter. A NATO official, quoted by the US Department of Defense, admitted that the alliance was closely watching the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and incorporating its lessons into plans to improve training, capabilities, and innovation. Policymakers in Moscow were not fooled either. Before the exercises began, Russia's foreign ministry claimed that NATO was conducting a demonstration of force on Russia's doorstep. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Alexander Grushko, called Steadfast Defender the irrevocable return of the alliance to Cold War hostility. Another spokesman for the Russian government, Dmitry Peskov, said that the exercises were quite unprecedented and that NATO was making no attempt to hide the fact that they were aimed against Russia. On February 5th, former Russian President and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev warned on social media that there was a potential for a big war with NATO, and said that Steadfast Defender 2024 came as a result of Western politicians who have shit their pants. Their mediocre NATO generals have once again decided to scare us. Medvedev insisted that Russia would never strike first against a NATO country, but that it would be prepared to respond to an attack against its own integrity or increased NATO association with Ukraine. Not coincidentally, Vladimir Putin himself traveled to Kaliningrad shortly after Steadfast Defender began. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russians have done more than complain about Steadfast Defender. They have tried to undermine it. On January 20th, before the exercises began, the ISW accused Russia of conducting an information operation to misrepresent the NATO exercise. According to the ISW, the Kremlin's information operation against Steadfast Defender came in several dimensions. Firstly, it tried to portray the drills as a provocation on the part of NATO. This cannot be the truth because the exercise is based on a simulated Article 5 scenario. Article 5 in the North Atlantic Treaty is by law defensive in nature. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. The North Atlantic Treaty, therefore, establishes that NATO is a defensive alliance. It does not cover the scenarios of a member provoking or aggressing against another country. Article 5 cannot be invoked for such purposes. The Steadfast Defender exercise also came in direct response against Russia's increasing provocations, not only against Ukraine, but against former members of the alliance. A case in point can be found in leaked Kremlin documents that were composed in the fall of 2021 by Russia's Directorate for Interregional Relations and Cultural Contacts. These documents were leaked to Swedish media in May 2023. They revealed that Russia would attempt to increase its influence over the Baltic states and reduce NATO's presence there between 2022 and 2030. In the short term, Russia sought to create new centers of influence, like NGOs, to promote closer cooperation between the Baltic states and itself, and preserve historical memory by stopping the demolition of Soviet-era monuments. NATO and its relations with the Baltic states is a key area of focus for the Kremlin. Stopping NATO's plans to build a permanent base in Lithuania by 2030, the militarization of Lithuanian territory, as the relevant document called it, is one of the plan's primary concerns. By 2030, Russia also aims to get the Baltic states to reverse course in their opinion on NATO. Through opinion-shaping operations, the Kremlin aims for the Baltic states to come to view NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe as potentially damaging to their national security. As such, Russia wants to stop their increasing cooperation with NATO's forward presence in Eastern Europe and gradually restore ties with these former Soviet states, including military ties. Russia plans to foster pro-Moscow politicians in the Baltic states and take advantage of the presence of the sizable ethnic Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia. Although the documents outline plans for Russia to use soft power methods like the promotion of cultural ties and increase of cross-border investments, Moscow plans to use harder methods too. One of these is to stop the Baltic states from leaving the treaty that synchronizes their electric grids into a shared network with Russia and Belarus. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are in the process of integrating their power grids with Europe. The Baltic states plan to complete this process after a test at the end of 2025, and from that point forward, abandon the shared grid with Russia and Belarus. The Russian documents identified this plan as a threat. These documents are similar to the ones Russia drafted concerning Belarus, which some believe is an annexation plan. It is likely that the officials who wrote these documents did not know that Putin had plans to invade Ukraine, as there were no such hints, and many of their theories seem much more outlandish now than even in 2021. Nevertheless, the documents outlined Russia's general attitude of disrespect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states that had once been within the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. Tellingly, Russia explicitly mentioned the Baltic states when responding to the NATO drills. According to the Kremlin, the alliance was using the Steadfast Defender exercise to wind up and provoke the Baltic states into a war with Russia. This is the attitude that NATO's Steadfast Defender exercises were designed in response to. It's not a coincidence that these exercises came after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the revelation of these sorts of plans. Russia's rhetorical attempt to shift the narrative to NATO being the aggressor is not only a bid to escape scrutiny for its aggressive actions, it can also be seen as a way to shape the information environment for future moves against the Baltic states, as Moscow may claim that it's responding to a potential attack. In general, Putin has identified and viewed the Western powers as his and Russia's enemy, and his response to Steadfast Defender was not the first time he has attempted to create this information environment. He has repeatedly claimed that he is fighting in Ukraine because of Western aggression and threats against Russia. According to the ISW, recent Russian electronic warfare exercises in Kaliningrad may have also been more of a grey zone operation than a strict exercise. These exercises took place between December 25th and 27th, 2023, and again between January 10th and 16th, 2024. The Russian exercises reportedly caused unprecedentedly high GPS jamming in northern and central Poland, as well as in the southern Baltic area. It's in this context that NATO decided to conduct the largest exercise since the Cold War. While Steadfast Defender has gone smoothly so far, the exercise comes at a time of peril for the alliance. Russia is gaining momentum in Ukraine, albeit at a high price. The Russian military has suffered enormously, but has adapted to developments on the battlefield, including with the use of drones. NATO countries have also shown vulnerability. On the day before Steadfast Defender began, the alliance reported that it would miss its overall target for spending 2% of GDP on defense, as most of the members would not hit that mark. While NATO members have increased their defense spending since 2014 and pledged to greatly increase military expenditures following the invasion of Ukraine, only 11 of the 32 members of the alliance spent at least 2% in 2023. More are expected to reach the goal this year, including Montenegro, North Macedonia, Denmark, and the newest NATO member, Sweden. However, Western European countries continue to fall short of the target, testing America's patience in the process. During a bitterly partisan presidential election, experts warn that Western Europe is running out of time to get its act together. While President Biden has been more patient, he is deeply unpopular at home, and both of his immediate predecessors were far more critical of NATO countries being free riders. There is no guarantee that his successor, whoever it is, will be as patient as he is. Furthermore, Russia has been more resilient in the face of sanctions than many in the West had hoped for. Russia's economy survived the temporary shock and has transitioned to a war footing. Russia has kept pace with productions of tanks, vehicles, missiles, and other pieces of military hardware. Meanwhile, many NATO allies have low stockpiles of ammunition, which have been further stressed in supplying Ukraine. This reality has caused officials from Germany, Belgium, and Sweden to warn that NATO allies have a short window to prepare for a potential war with Russia. Admiral Rob Bauer of the Netherlands, the chairman of NATO's military committee, warned that the West has grown too accustomed to peace and needs to be more prepared for conflict, which will involve the whole of society, whether we like it or not. This reveals the purpose of Steadfast Defender 2024. NATO allies are working together in a series of maneuvers of unprecedented size to prepare for a potential war, and Russia's conduct toward NATO's members and the alliance as a whole has only reinforced the need for preparedness. The results of Steadfast Defender will undoubtedly be discussed and analyzed at the 2024 NATO summit to be held in Washington between July 9th and 11th. These results will likely be the foundation for future exercises and a general transition of the alliance toward a state of further readiness for conflict. Overall, Steadfast Defender is a sign of the times. NATO officials have warned that Western countries had become complacent in the belief that history had ended in 1991. That was not the case, and now the alliance must relearn the skills and acquire a state of readiness that had been allowed to atrophy. Do you think Steadfast Defender exercises will assist NATO in its preparedness? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. In Ukraine's battle for air supremacy with Russia, a swarm of tiny Black Hornet drones might just give it the edge. These drones act as eyes for Ukrainian troops on the ground, and thanks to the US, UK, and Norway, Ukraine now has an entire fleet of them ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. In July 2023, the United States announced that it would deliver $400 million in security assistance to Ukraine. Beyond the typical armored vehicles and air defense missiles, that package would also include Black Hornet drones made by Teledyne FLIR Defense. A month later, the UK made a similar announcement. Working with Norwegian manufacturers, it would spend $9 million on these micro-drones, sending them over to Ukraine for use as covert surveillance tools. All told, Ukraine now has over 1,000 of these drones at its disposal, and they're helping Kyiv slowly turn the tide against Putin's invading forces. But how? How could a tiny drone, designed to look like a helicopter, have such a huge impact? To answer that question, we must start by asking the following. What are Black Hornet drones? The simple answer is they are miniature unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, that are designed specifically for reconnaissance. Unlike many of the other drones that Ukraine uses, some of which come equipped with attack capabilities, the Black Hornet drone is all about stealth. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to its superpowers. The first generation of these drones was created in 2011 by Teledyne FLIR and quickly found themselves in heavy use in Afghanistan. They're designed to be small enough for ground-based troops to carry. They even come with their own carry case, and they can be deployed at a moment's notice. In Ukraine's case, they've received shipments of the Black Hornet 3, which measures just 6.6 inches from nose to tail and weighs only 1.16 ounces. In other words, they're tiny. So tiny, in fact, that the drones are easy to hide among foliage and trees, making them almost imperceptible to opposing troops unless the drones are flown straight into them. Furthermore, the drones are designed to be practically silent when in operation. The telltale buzzing that usually accompanies these types of UAVs isn't present, making it even harder to detect the Black Hornet. Also, unlike other drones, the Black Hornet does away with the quadcopter design that's typically used for UAVs. Instead, it looks like just a tiny helicopter, only one that's equipped with several high-definition cameras that are capable of sending footage to the operative controlling the drone. That design choice also means that Black Hornets can squeeze through much smaller gaps than quadcopter UAVs, ideal for sneaking into buildings and navigating difficult terrain. The Black Hornets have an impressive 25-minute flight time, giving the user plenty of time to get in and out with the drone, and takes about the same amount of time to recharge. As a result, the drone can be deployed several times per day, with each flight revealing more about the area over which it flies. But all of that tech doesn't come cheap. The most recent publicly available pricing for the drone puts it at $195,000 per unit. Given that Ukraine has received about 1,300 of the drones since the beginning of Putin's war, that would mean that Kyiv's Black Hornet fleet has cost $2.73 billion to date. That's a lot of money to spend on a fleet of tiny helicopters, but it's money well spent once you recognize the extent of the Black Hornet's abilities. First, there's the simple ease of deployment to consider. Unlike traditional drones, which often need to be launched from the ground and will weigh down any troops carrying them, the Black Hornet is so tiny that it can be launched from a soldier's hand. Seeing one take off is almost like watching somebody launch a toy helicopter. Just place it on a surface and hit a button. The drone zooms into the air to be directed by the soldier's remote control from the ground. That simplicity makes it a weapon of immense power. Granted, the Black Hornet has no attack capabilities, meaning it isn't a weapon in the traditional sense, but the fact that it can be launched by anyone from almost anywhere gives it a level of versatility that most drones simply don't offer. A platoon of soldiers could send several of them into the skies in an instant, giving them a clear bird's-eye view of the terrain below. And when the Black Hornet is done, it can be landed right back on the soldier's hand and tucked into a pocket. However, the miniature nature of the drones does come with some downsides. When the British first started using the Black Hornet in Afghanistan in 2013, they found that something very simple could cause issues: a gust of wind. According to one soldier, a good gust of wind will send the Black Hornet off, meaning that Ukraine's soldiers face some limitations when using them. Still, those limitations aren't quite as severe as what the Brits faced. Back then, the Black Hornet weighed just 16 grams, making it easy to knock off course. The third generation of the device, the one being sent to Ukraine, is a little heavier and is now capable of standing winds of up to 17.3 miles per hour. That's more strength than the Black Hornet used to have. However, according to the Beaufort wind scale, a 17.3 mile per hour wind qualifies as a moderate breeze. If the wind is strong enough to raise dust from the ground or rustle loose paper, it's probably strong enough to knock a Black Hornet off course. Rain can also be an issue. According to Teledyne FLIR's specifications document, the Black Hornet can handle precipitation of 0.1 inches, which qualifies as a light rain. Anything above that means the rain is so heavy that the tiny drone can't fly properly, meaning it's best deployed when conditions are clear. Still, it has a solid temperature range of between 14 and 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit, making it usable in freezing cold conditions and extremely hot locations. Having a weapon that can be overcome with a decent gust of wind or a little bit of rain might not seem like the best idea in the world. But the Black Hornet makes up for that design issue, which is inherent in something as small as the drone, with amazing stealth capabilities. The drone comes equipped with a set of tiny electronic motors that are battery-powered and combined with the aerodynamic design to make it extremely quiet when it's in the air. The drone is practically silent, with almost none of the telltale buzzing seen in other UAVs. That's ideal for its use to surveil hostile environments. Even a slight amount of background noise serves as enough cover to make the Black Hornet drone almost impossible to hear. According to engineering.com, a soldier will have no idea it's even there as long as the drone stays more than 10 feet away from them. That near silence is complemented by a smart design to emphasize control. Assuming the drone flies in relatively windless conditions, its slight wing shape, coupled with a design inspired by birds and insects, means it can be controlled almost perfectly. The drone can turn on a dime, with little to no build-up needed to get it to navigate corners. Again, that makes it useful in stealth operations, as a soldier can quickly fly the Black Hornet around a corner or behind a tree to prevent anybody from being aware of its presence. The vortex generators installed on the Black Hornet's wings play a large part in improving the drone's handling. These generators create small vortices of air localized to small portions of the wings that allow for easier control when the drone is moving at slow speeds. The generators also reduce stall speeds, allowing the user to quickly slow down and, when conducting surveillance, to have the drone hover in place so it can get clear shots of its surroundings. Better yet, the drone can fly up to heights of 1.5 kilometers, approximately 0.93 miles, again allowing for quick escapes. Then there are the Black Hornet's image capturing capabilities to consider. The drone often comes in sets of two, with one being equipped with cameras to capture daytime footage, while the other specializes in shooting footage at night. The unit comes with a pair of electro-optical, or EO, cameras, one at the front and one that shoots footage below the drone that can capture video at a 640 by 480 resolution. If a soldier wants to take photos of the environment, those EO cameras can send back pictures with a resolution of 1600 by 1200, strong enough to record even the smallest of details on the battlefield. The thermal imaging cameras built into the nighttime versions of the drone aren't as powerful. They deliver video and images at a resolution of 160 by 120. That's enough to get a general idea of how many troops may be in a location, for instance, though not detailed enough to deliver any specifics. All imagery and video can be recorded or streamed live to a tablet operated by the user, with the Black Hornet having a radio range of 1.24 miles. That's more than enough for covert operatives to maintain their distance from a target while surveilling it. Best of all, every scrap of the drone's recorded footage is encrypted and stored on a 64GB SD card that can be easily removed or replaced as needed. The same goes for the cameras, all can be replaced with spares if they happen to go offline for any reason. The manufacturers have gone to great lengths to ensure that the cameras are easy to use. With the tablet that comes with the Hornet, a soldier can simply tap a screen to take a snapshot, all while watching streamed video. It's almost like playing a video game. Using the tablet and a remote control, the user moves the drone around, hitting a button to take snapshots whenever they're needed. But what if a soldier doesn't want to put themselves at risk while controlling the drone? Thanks to the Black Hornet's advanced artificial intelligence, or AI systems, they don't have to. Each Black Hornet comes equipped with an autonomous navigation mode that allows the user to pre-program a flight route into it. That programming means it can fly to its target without being directly controlled, with the drone even having the ability to return to its dock automatically when it senses that it's running out of juice. The AI built into the drone is also able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. That's ideal if wind or rain pushes it off course. Using its AI, the Black Hornet can course correct, so it gets back onto its intended flight path. This autonomy is achieved through a small array of onboard sensors built into the drone, which help it to detect obstacles nearby so that it doesn't accidentally collide with them. Advanced GPS built into the drone also makes it easy to set a route. Simply choose a location, and the drone can use its GPS systems to figure out the best way to get there. All of that data that the Black Hornet picks up via its sensors is fed through complex AI algorithms, enabling it to fly safely without anybody being in direct control. There's even an optional visual-based navigation unit that the drone can use to fly indoors when it has no access to GPS. So it's an impressive piece of technology. But how has Ukraine been using the Black Hornet? The clear and most obvious use is for reconnaissance and surveillance. As Ukrainian troops advance on Russian positions, they can deploy the drones ahead of themselves to get the lay of the land before they launch operations. And thanks to the drone's high-resolution cameras, they can track Russian troop movements easily, figuring out the best times and places to strike. Think about this potential scenario. A Ukrainian platoon advances to the edge of a Russian position. Hiding out of sight, a soldier launches a Black Hornet, and sends it flying high above the Russians, where the drone spends about 20 minutes recording footage and sending snapshots. Immediately, the Ukrainians can see how many soldiers are stationed at the Russian position, as well as get detailed imagery of artillery and other weapons. They'll also see weak points. Any gaps in the Russian defense can be picked up by the Black Hornet, with the drone being small enough to fly in and out of buildings, as well as around rubble, to locate an ideal attack position. And as one drone runs out of power and has to return to the soldier who launched it, another drone can be sent into the skies to replace it. That's where the drone's small size becomes a massive advantage. According to The Economist, a single Ukrainian platoon has 20 soldiers. Each of these soldiers could easily carry a Black Hornet, delivering about 400 minutes of surveillance footage per platoon. A small fleet of Hornets could easily surveil an entire Russian station in minutes, with the footage being stitched together to reveal everything about what the platoon will face when it launches its attack. The Russians would have no idea that the Hornets are even above them. It's this ability to surveil that also helps Ukraine to knock Russian jets out of the sky. The Black Hornet is so tiny that it simply doesn't show up on a jet's radar, and even if a pilot spots it, the jet won't be able to do a thing to destroy the drone. The Black Hornet is far more maneuverable. Before the pilot could even adjust their jet to fire on it, the drone would be gone, likely heading back to its user. And just like that, the Ukrainians would know exactly where the jet is and the flight path it's taking. The Russian pilot would have two choices: either abort their mission and turn back, risking the wrath of Moscow by failing to complete their objective, or carry on flying, likely into Ukrainian anti-air defenses, and risk losing their plane and their own life. It's a lose-lose situation. Assuming the pilot even sees the Black Hornet tracking them, the likelihood is that they won't, meaning the Ukrainians can launch their anti-air attacks before the pilot even realizes what's happening. These scenarios aren't outside the realms of possibility. According to the European Council on Foreign Relations, or ECFR, Ukraine used the larger TB2 drone to help it target the initial Russian convoy that tried to ride into Kyiv. It's also believed that a TB2 was used to distract the defenses of the Moskva ship, giving Ukrainian soldiers enough time to fire the naval missiles that ultimately sank the Russian vessel. With the Black Hornet, Ukraine has an even smaller drone at its disposal, one that will help targeting without ever being spotted by the enemy. Consider also the propaganda uses of the Black Hornet. Recording footage of Russian troop movements may be useful for Ukrainian attacks, but it also shines a light on what those troops are doing as they advance. Every atrocity committed, every civilian killed. If a Black Hornet is present, it can all be filmed and distributed, helping Ukraine to make an even better case for why the rest of the world needs to help them overcome the Russian threat. And thanks to the Black Hornet's high-resolution snapshots and high-quality video feeds, there will be no doubting any of the footage the drone shot. Again, this is a proven Ukrainian tactic. Kyiv has used drones to document the destruction of several Ukrainian cities during the war, as well as the breaching of the Kakhovka Dam. It also uses drones to record its own attacks against Russian ships, tanks, and jets, all valuable morale-boosting propaganda to spread among its forces. There's also the simple fact that using drones protects troops. In the case of the Black Hornet, that's been a proven benefit of these UAVs since they were first deployed in Afghanistan. Newsweek made that clear when it shared the comments of Major Adam Foden, a British soldier who used them during his time fighting against Afghan insurgents. Previously, we would have sent soldiers forward to see if there were any enemy fighters hiding inside a set of buildings, he said. Now we are deploying Black Hornets to look inside compounds and to clear a route through enemy-held spaces. Ukraine is doing the same. Every Black Hornet deployed accounts for one soldier who doesn't have to risk their life to surveil a Russian position. Ukraine gets to protect its troops, who can stay over a mile away from a Russian position, while still receiving a clear video feed that shows them exactly what they need to know. This risk reduction means that a Ukrainian platoon doesn't have to take any chances and lose valuable members just to figure out how to launch an attack. It can use Black Hornets and attack at full strength every single time. However, using the Black Hornet doesn't come without risk. That was made clear in a July 2023 article published in Bulgarian Military, which said that soldiers from Russia's Wolves Brigade, a reconnaissance unit, had captured two of the drones. Both were seized during a shootout in Novaya Tavlzhanka that resulted in the Russians managing to retain the trophy control complex. That was a significant event. The Black Hornet is made using proprietary technology to which the Russians don't currently have access. Teledyne FLIR isn't selling to them, which means they can't fill the skies with swarms like the Ukrainians can. Yet. Now that they have a pair of these drones, Russia can try to reverse engineer them to figure out the science and tech behind how they work. Whether they'll be successful or not is another matter. The Black Hornet uses encryption to protect the videos that it shoots, so you have to assume that it has even more powerful encryption guarding the AI algorithms and subroutines built into its system. But even if it takes Russia years to come up with its own version of the Black Hornet, the fact that it has the tech in its hands makes the process a little more straightforward. And even if Moscow decides not to go down the reverse engineering route, it can at least use this pair of Hornets. It can figure out their capabilities and possibly figure out a way to counter them. Or with more captures, it may be able to build up a small fleet that it can use to plan attacks of its own in the future. The Ukrainians could start to see their own tech being used against them if they're not careful. Still, the use of Black Hornet drones has been a massive boom for Ukraine in its fight against Russia. The tiny drones have enabled Ukrainian soldiers to get the jump on Moscow's finest in more than a few conflicts, and have been valuable for capturing footage used for reconnaissance and even propaganda purposes. The only question we have left is simple. What does the future hold? Right now, the Black Hornet is relatively harmless in terms of its attack prowess. In short, it has none. There are no weapons built into the drone, meaning it exists solely to capture footage and shoot photos. But the potential exists to make it a much more dangerous device. Imagine a world where Teledyne FLIR decides to build a version of the Black Hornet that doesn't have a full array of cameras. Instead, they load it up with an explosive device, one that can be triggered from over a mile away, or thanks to the AI algorithms in the drone, programmed to explode once the Black Hornet reaches its location. The drone would become a silent killer. By the time the target realized that the drone was even there, it would be practically on top of them. It's only visible from 50 feet against a perfectly clear backdrop. You can only hear the minor buzzing the drone produces if the Black Hornet is 10 feet away. Could we see the war delve into scenarios where soldiers are constantly on the lookout for these miniature drones, taking potshots at any they see to prevent them from causing serious damage? Perhaps militaries will start to counter these drones with new tech that surrounds their installations with simulated winds and rainwater, preventing the Black Hornets from penetrating. Only the future will tell. For now, the Black Hornet is one of the most powerful weapons Ukraine has at its disposal, even if it's not technically a weapon. It gives troops clear sets of eyes in the sky, eyes that can work day and night, that provide valuable information for missions. Added to the many other drones that Ukraine is using, as well as the many that its civilians use to capture footage for their own military, and Putin's war may go down in history as the first to truly feature drone warfare. So what do you think about the Black Hornet? Is this impressive little device everything that it's cracked up to be, or do you see flaws that could be overcome in the future? Maybe you have some other ideas about how it may be used to Ukraine's advantage. Tell us what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching the video. The prolonged conflict in Ukraine, now stretching well into its third year, has witnessed relentless Ukrainian resilience against formidable odds. While Russian forces have claimed minor territorial gains since the fall of Avdiivka in February, the reality is that these are costly and largely symbolic. Ukraine's strategic countermaneuvers and the staunch defense of key positions like northern Donetsk Oblast and the areas surrounding Bakhmut and Vuhledar in Zaporizhia Oblast underscore a narrative not just of survival, but of calculated resistance. This strategic endurance is all the more remarkable given Ukraine's current artillery challenges. Dubbed shell hunger, this shortfall has seen daily artillery discharges dwindle from 10,000 shells to roughly 2,000. This, coupled with damage to many Ukrainian howitzers due to precise Russian counter-battery efforts and new drone tactics, has undeniably strained Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Yet despite these setbacks, the spirit of Ukrainian forces remains unbroken. In contrast to the narrative of Russian advancement, the reality of the battlefield tells a different story. Russian forces, despite an extensive artillery arsenal and support from rogue states like North Korea, are achieving only marginal gains at an unsustainable cost. Their reliance on volume over tactical efficiency has not translated into decisive success, highlighting the inefficiencies and desperation underlying their military strategy. Amid these challenging dynamics, a beacon of support shines from Denmark. This Scandinavian ally has stepped up, ready to alter the course of events with significant artillery contributions. This move is not just a military aid package, it's a symbol of a shifting European foreign policy landscape that increasingly seeks to support Ukraine's staunch defense efforts. But how transformative could Denmark's involvement be, and what does this mean for the balance of power on the front lines? As Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov advocates for more Western artillery and ammunition, Denmark's commitment could very well be a game-changer. Providing the much-needed artillery might not only alleviate Ukraine's shell hunger, but could also empower Ukrainian forces to reclaim momentum. This support from Denmark and other Western nations underscores a collective international commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience, setting the stage for a pivotal shift in the ongoing conflict. But how exactly is Denmark stepping up in this crucial hour? Before we explore their pivotal contributions, let's rewind to the events that set this commitment in motion. Just 2 days after the fall of Avdiivka, a bold announcement came from the north. Denmark pledged to donate all of its existing artillery units to Ukraine. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen broke sharply with Europe's cautious stance on arms support, criticizing the continent's hesitancy and highlighting the available resources. This is not only a question about production, because we have weapons, we have ammunition, we have air defenses that we don't have to use ourselves at the moment, that we should deliver to Ukraine. With this declaration, Denmark not only promised critical military support, but also challenged other nations to reassess their positions. You see, to prove the point that such a donation would not be crippling to its arsenal, Denmark's Ministry of Defense said it was in the process of acquiring new military capabilities on a rapid basis to make up for the loss of units. In Munich, Frederiksen also stressed the importance of not waiting for a politically divided United States to take the lead on supplying the Ukrainians. It doesn't matter what the US comes up with. We Europeans have to defend ourselves. This is a war on the European continent. Frederiksen's remarks were the latest example of Denmark's evolving geopolitical strategy, and it's helpful to see Copenhagen's artillery donation in that light. Although Denmark was one of the founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949 and played a pivotal geostrategic role thanks to its control of the Baltic's western choke points, its overall level of security integration with the rest of Europe was not as well advanced. Until June 2022, Denmark was the only one of the European nation's 27 member states which did not participate in the latter's common security policy. Denmark did not take part in the EU defense discussions, nor get involved with the joint military missions. These opt-outs originated with Denmark's initial rejection of the Maastricht Treaty in a 1992 referendum. To secure Denmark's accession to the European Union, Copenhagen was granted a number of exceptions to the Maastricht Treaty through the Edinburgh Agreement. One of these involved defense issues. With these opt-outs in place, Danish voters agreed to join the EU on such terms in a second referendum the following year. This security opt-out policy was in tradition with Denmark's Cold War footing. Although it was a member of NATO, Denmark did not allow any foreign forces on its soil under the alliance's auspices. The Soviet Union was the dominant power in the Baltic and had troops in nearby Germany, troops which outnumbered the West's. Denmark wanted to place itself under America's nuclear umbrella, but did not otherwise want to risk upsetting the Soviet Union. Recent historical experience reminded Danish policymakers of the importance of this goal. British forces only barely prevented the Red Army from pushing on to Denmark when they captured the city of Lübeck in northern Germany on May 2, 1945, only hours before Soviet troops came into the area. The Soviet Union had also occupied the Danish island of Bornholm, which sits on strategic territory in the Baltic since the previous year. Bornholm is an island roughly in the middle of the strait between Sweden's southern coast and Poland's northern one. A military presence there can cut off movement between east and west in the Baltic. Fortunately for the Danes on Bornholm, Stalin agreed to withdraw the Red Army from the island and did so in April 1946, thus making it a rare example of the Iron Curtain receding in the immediate post-World War II era. However, Stalin's move only came with the understanding that Denmark would not host foreign troops on its soil, even though it was in the West's sphere of influence. American and British policymakers quietly agreed about this, and the unspoken agreement held throughout the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, Denmark slackened on its defense spending. It last spent 2% of its GDP on defense in 1989 and fell to a low of 1.1% in 2015. But that's now starting to change too. As it further integrated itself with European and NATO security networks and gradually ended the policy of quasi-neutrality, Denmark also pledged that it would increase its defense spending and hit the 2% mark by 2033, although there will undoubtedly be many voices in the West that say this rate of increase is too slow. Either way, recent moves in Denmark suggest that its long period of relative military neutrality is coming to an end, and this policy shift has been sanctioned by Danish voters. On June 1, 2022, Denmark held a referendum that asked a simple question. Do you vote yes or no on Denmark being able to participate in the European defense and security cooperation by abolishing the EU defense opt-out? Amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Danish voters chose yes by a margin of nearly 67 to 32%. The vote therefore ended Copenhagen's comparative military isolation from the rest of Europe. The result meant that Danish troops could participate in joint military operations under the EU's banner and have more of an influence in joint European defense policy. More importantly, the result of the referendum made it far easier for the Danish military to acquire weapons and equipment, which is one of the reasons why Copenhagen understands that it can donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Russia reacted negatively to the news and stopped supplying natural gas to one of Denmark's power companies. Although this did not significantly affect Denmark's energy supply, the move was another demonstration of Russia's willingness to use coercive methods as a means of statecraft. These maneuvers on the part of Moscow likely only further convinced Danish voters that they had made the right decision. Even before the invasion, Denmark was signaling the beginning of its seismic shift in security policy. As Russia was gathering its forces along the Ukrainian border and an invasion seemed imminent, PM Frederiksen suggested that negotiations were ongoing with the United States on a new bilateral defense agreement that could station American troops and military equipment on Danish soil for the first time. Danish Defense Minister Morten Bødskov said any new agreement would be designed to give American forces better access to Europe. The agreement would also likely allow for more cross-training between American and Danish troops, and perhaps more importantly, could make acquiring new military equipment and ammunition easier for the Danes. Once it joined the broader European defense community, Denmark demonstrated its disproportionate willingness to supply Ukraine. It's one of the major donors of F-16 fighter jets, supplying the Ukrainians with 19 of them, which should be sent out by 2025. This is the broader context behind Denmark's more recent decision to donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Copenhagen's donation of artillery amounts to a small sum, as it has no MLRS units or towed artillery. Rather, the GFI lists Denmark as having 19 self-propelled artillery units, with 15 of them being in a state of readiness. These units are the French-made Caesar self-propelled howitzer. The Caesar entered service in 2008 and has an operational range of about 600 kilometers, with a crew between 3 and 5 operators. Each unit has a typical magazine of 36 shells. The Caesar fires NATO standard 155mm ammunition up to a range of 34 kilometers and up to 42 kilometers when using an extended range full-bore shell, ERFB. These rounds were originally designed by the Canadian artillery engineer Gerard Bull, who became famous for working on the concept of Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon superguns, Big Babylon and Baby Babylon. Bull was assassinated in 1990, possibly by Israeli agents who did not want to see the Iraqis' superguns become a reality. Unlike standard rounds, these shells are longer and thinner. ERFB rounds have peculiar nubs around their midsections, which help to engage the rifling in the gun and stabilize the projectile in flight, although later ERFB rounds may not have these. ERFB rounds have significantly increased range compared to a standard shell, but at the cost of reduced accuracy. The decreased accuracy has meant that the ERFB round has not become a NATO standard, but the Caesar is nevertheless capable of firing it. The Caesar can increase its range even further, up to a range of 52 kilometers, when it uses rocket-assisted shells. Each Caesar costs about $7.5 million per unit, but the pricing depends on individual contracts. As an example, the acquisition of 52 Caesar howitzers was approved by the Czech Ministry of Defense on September 1, 2021, and the value of that contract is around $288 million. The Caesar has to this point performed well in the war. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but it may be more than coincidental that after Ukraine started to receive its Caesar guns, Russian artillery units began to suffer heavy losses. Its introduction, therefore, seems to have coincided with better Ukrainian counter-battery fire. At the height of the Ukrainian gunners' effectiveness, the Russians were supposedly losing between 20 and 40 artillery systems per day. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Caesar was not enough to turn the tide, as the Russians dug in with the benefit of the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since the First World War. Ukraine's Zaporizhia campaign failed to reach even its first objective, the road junction at Tokmak. As of April 2024, the Oryx blog lists a visually confirmed 8 losses of Caesar units. 5 have been destroyed and 3 damaged. Denmark's donation of its 19 Caesars comes amid new French donations of the unit. Sensing the desperate shortage of artillery for the Ukrainians, France announced in January that it intended to deliver an additional 78 Caesar units to Ukraine and sought €280 million to assist with 60 of these. While Denmark was already sending all of its Caesar artillery units to Ukraine by April 2023, Fredriksson's remarks in Munich were an announcement that it would be sending a different system there too. In addition to the Caesar units, Denmark has 21 X-21 Cardon mortars, which will now be on their way to Ukraine. The Cardon was originally created in Israel and can be chambered to fire 81 or 120mm shells. The 120mm Cordon is muzzle-loaded, but despite this, the mortar has a burst rate of 16 rounds per minute and a sustained rate of fire of around 4 rounds per minute. The Cardon operates on an autonomous recoil system and is controlled by computers, although it can be laid and targeted manually with its backup handles and optical sights if the computerized fire control is compromised. The Cardon has an effective range of about 7.2 kilometers. To improve accuracy, the Danes decided to equip their Cardon mortars with MVRS 700SC muzzle velocity radar systems manufactured by their domestic Weibel company. This system takes account of atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity, which influence the conditions in the barrel and therefore the muzzle velocity of the mortar's round, which in turn influences the accuracy of its fire. The MVRS 700SC's presence allows the Danish Cardon systems to compensate for environmental conditions and improve their accuracy. This radar system is integrated with the Cardon's computerized fire control system through an antenna and a processor. The Danes received the Cardon in 2019 and specifically sought to use it as mobile firepower. Following Russia's original intervention in Ukraine in 2014, one of the lessons Denmark took away was the vulnerability of artillery to counter battery fire thanks to radar and drone detection. To adapt to this reality, the Danes decided to integrate the Israeli Cardon mortar with their new Piranha 5 armored personnel carrier. The integration better allows the Cardon to deliver fire support and then move away before the enemy can spot it and retaliate. Denmark's decision to send its entire artillery force to Ukraine is the latest sign of a gradually changing philosophy among the Western powers. As the war commenced, Western nations were cautious about escalating the conflict, hesitating to supply Ukraine with high-impact weaponry such as long-range ballistic and cruise missiles. This cautious stance began to shift dramatically in 2023, marked by significant support, including main battle tanks, cluster bombs, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and the pivotal American ATACMS for Ukraine's HIMARS units. Despite these substantial commitments, which initially raised concerns about escalation, the successful utilization of these systems by Ukraine in 2022 helped to alleviate fears, shifting the focus toward the potential depletion of Western arsenals. Years of peace, along with a focus on counter-terrorism, had not prepared the West for the intense demands of modern, high-intensity warfare, where sophisticated ammunition is consumed at an alarming rate. This concern is compounded by the complexity and vulnerability of the supply chains needed to produce and distribute modern precision munitions. Yet the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen argued that supporting Ukraine, even at the expense of Western stockpiles, was a strategic necessity. In her view, a Russian defeat in Ukraine would ultimately enhance Western security more reliably than maintaining large arsenals at home. While Denmark's contribution of artillery might not decisively tip the scales of the war, Frederiksen hoped her bold move would catalyze broader European support, encouraging a more substantial collective effort. This hope seemed to be materializing when, at a Munich conference, Czech defense official Jan Jiras revealed that 800,000 artillery shells could be procured from non-Western stockpiles for Ukraine at a cost of $1.5 billion, proposing a feasible solution to swiftly bolster Ukraine's artillery capabilities. His announcement underscored a growing willingness among European nations to find innovative ways to support Ukraine's defense and maintain the momentum in its counteroffensive efforts. On March 8th, Czech President Petr Pavel announced that a group of 18 countries had funded the purchase of all of those shells in full. Germany alone would buy 180,000 rounds with a price tag of $618 million, which amounted to 40% of the total. Denmark also participated in the financing alongside Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. The effort that Denmark contributed to resulted in the procurement of about 400,000 of the shells. At about the same time, the Czechs identified a further 700,000 idle artillery shells that could be purchased for $1.8 billion. Ukraine's Western allies, including Denmark, have agreed to purchase these also. Thanks to Europe's collective efforts, Ukraine's artillery and shell shortage looks like it will end by this summer, when the Czech-brokered ammunition begins to arrive. The expected date of delivery is June. As the summer matures, Ukraine might begin to fire around 6,000 shells per day, 3 times as many as now. The number might grow further to 10,000 per day, now that the divided United States Congress has decided to deliver additional aid. Ukraine's shell hunger is about to end. And the way in which it will come to an end is an item of evidence in favor of PM Fredriksen's notion of the need for Europe to take the lead in its own defense. For her, defeating Russia in Ukraine now, even if it means a depletion of valuable military stockpiles at home, is a preferable option to using those weapons in a future on one's own doorstep in another, worse conflict down the line. But will the rest of Europe follow suit? Do you agree with PM Fredriksen? Should Western countries send much more of their available arsenals to Ukraine? Is this the best way for Europe to secure itself from future Russian aggression? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to help the channel and for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out why Russia can't stop US weapons, or click this other video instead. In this video, we're diving into an astonishing story. How Ukraine managed to shoot down 11 Russian aircraft in just 11 days, dealing a significant blow to Russia's already struggling air campaign. But what does this mean in the larger context of the air war as of March 2024? What are the risks and challenges both sides are now facing? We'll spotlight the downing of 8 Su-34s, 2 Su-35s, and notably one Beriev A-50 radar plane, a particularly rare and notable achievement. But how did Ukraine pull off this impressive feat, especially against the Beriev A-50? And what impact has this had on the tactics and morale of both the Ukrainian and Russian forces? Stay with us as we unpack these critical moments and their implications in the ongoing conflict. The Beriev A-50, akin to America's E-3 Sentry, plays a crucial role as an airborne early warning and control (AWACS) aircraft. These AWACS planes are vital for command, communications, and control within a war zone's airspace. But what specific functions have these planes served in the Ukrainian conflict? Well, Russia's AWACS planes have helped to detect incoming missiles and connect troops on the front line with their headquarters, which are usually hundreds of miles away. The comms link provided by the A-50 has magnified in importance after Russia needed to move such headquarters further back from the line to guard against HIMARS attacks. Each A-50 comes with a crew of up to 15 men. However, a video released on February 23rd seemed to show the wreckage of an A-50 in the Russian territory of Krasnodar Krai, east of the Sea of Azov. The loss was in fact the second loss of an A-50 plane this year, following on the heels of an incident in January. Ukrainian sources claim that 5 majors, 3 captains, a lieutenant, and a sergeant major were killed in the attack. The loss of experienced airmen like these is as big a blow to the Russian aerospace forces as the loss of the aircraft itself. But how did Ukraine manage such a precise and impactful strike? It appears that the January incident was executed using one of Ukraine's Patriot missile batteries. Russia has guarded its A-50 planes from Ukrainian air defenses by typically deploying them outside the 75-mile range of the S-300 air defense system, which Ukraine has in good numbers. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, the Patriot with its PAC-2 missile has a 90-mile range, and the Russian brass seems not to have expected Ukraine to use its newer air defense systems in this way. Here's the interesting part though. The February incident might have involved an S-200 air defense system from the Cold War. The A-50 targeted in that incident was positioned at least 120 miles away from the front lines, a distance beyond the reach of the PAC-2 missile. This leads to a crucial question. What enabled the Ukrainians to strike at such a distance? It turns out the Soviet-era S-200's 5V-28 missile was the key, possessing the necessary range to make this strike possible. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had about 16 S-200 systems spread across the country. Initially, with the war's outbreak, Ukraine brought some of these systems out of storage, using them mainly against ground targets, including targets within Russian territory. Now it appears Ukraine is employing the S-200 for its intended purpose, aerial defense. But what challenges has Ukraine faced in adapting these Soviet-era systems to modern warfare? The S-200, while a powerful system, has its drawbacks when compared to the Patriot. It's far less accurate, and the 5V-28 missile is heavy at 8 tons, including a 500-pound warhead, making it difficult to transport. However, the Ukrainians seem to have improved its accuracy with small GPS seekers installed in place of the traditional guidance system. Against a target with a lack of maneuverability like the A-50, this seems to be more than enough. To make matters worse for the Russian aerospace forces, Ukraine might have as many as 1,000 5V-28 missiles in its arsenal and have assistance from the Poles to maintain the chemicals needed to propel them. A third A-50 was damaged in a drone strike last year. The loss of these planes is a heavy blow to Russia's Air Force. Only about 40 A-50s were ever made, and Russia had only 9 modernized A-50s available before the start of the war. It now has just 7, and only 6 are operational. Russian industry is now scrambling to replace the lost planes, but this will come at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. Russia has also been trying to field the A-50's successor, the A-100, but there is only one of these, and sanctions mean that it will be more difficult for Russia to get its hands on the electronics this plane needs to operate. In the meantime, Russia's ability to control the skies over Ukraine, particularly in the south around the all-important Crimea, has weakened. Ukraine's destruction of the A-50s flying near its airspace has eliminated about a third of the sensor coverage that Russia's air fleet can create. This results in a lack of information that could make other planes vulnerable. Crimea has also been put at elevated risk in another way. Raids last year knocked out some of the ground-based radars on the peninsula. Russia turned to the A-50 to plug the gap. The loss of the 2 A-50s make Crimea even more prone to drone and missile attacks, which have already forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat from Sevastopol, its traditional base. Russia will therefore have good reason to keep its AWACS aircraft even further back from the front, harming C&C and making Russian forces less adaptable, particularly with their top-heavy command structure, which discourages initiative in junior officers. You can expect more drone and missile strikes on Crimea and other targets of opportunity as Russia's eyes in the sky grow less capable. Russia had once counted on its A-50s to cover 3 broad areas in the south, east, and north to extend sensor coverage across the entire front in eastern Ukraine. Each of these 3 areas would have 3 A-50s on coverage. But what happens now when one of these planes has been damaged and 2 destroyed? It seems Putin is steadily losing his ability to cover the front. Ukraine's successes in downing these Russian planes has effectively multiplied its forces' combat effectiveness, facilitating easier targeting of other Russian aircraft and enabling surprise attacks on ground positions. This brings up a crucial point. How has Ukraine been adapting and using other air defense systems, not just for defense, but also as offensive tools? Alongside these strikes, Ukraine has been creatively employing its NASAMS systems, which are likely contributing to the recent downing of additional Russian aircraft. NASAMS are equipped with missiles like the AIM-9X Sidewinder and the AIM-120 AMRAAM, typically found on fighter jets. Increasingly, around February 26th, Russian forces destroyed one of Ukraine's NASAMS near Zaporizhia, indicating that these systems might be deployed closer to the front lines for offensive operations against Russian aircraft. NASAMS also has interoperability with the longer-range Patriot system, allowing for greater coverage against varieties of targets at different ranges and altitudes. With its Raytheon MPQ-64F1 Sentinel radar, it has 360-degree coverage and can track and acquire targets at ranges of up to 75 miles. The NASAM-2's AMRAAM missile has an effective range of about 48 miles. The NASAM-3's AMRAAM range goes further, up to about 80 miles. The Patriot's PAC-2's 90-mile range reinforces these operations if the 2 systems are used in conjunction. Both systems are probably being used as part of a mobile air defense strategy, being moved to hotspots along the front line in response to increased Russian sorties and then quickly moving away to avoid a retaliatory response from the Russian Air Force. Because the Patriot and NASAMS are mobile, they can move in and out as needed, although multiple vehicles will be needed for this, making the operation riskier should the Russians have good intelligence on where these systems will be deployed. But if Ukrainian forces are taking risks in the way they've begun to use these systems, the Russian forces are taking additional risks of their own, and the increased downing of Russian aircraft in recent days has as much to do with a shift in Russian strategy as it does a mobile, adaptable use of air defense systems by the Ukrainian troops near the front. After the fall of Avdiivka in February 2024, Ukraine's situation became increasingly dire, with a noticeable shortage of ammunition. This development has emboldened Russian ground forces, and consequently, their air force has begun flying more sorties closer to the front lines than ever before. But what does this change in Russian tactics reveal about their strategy and confidence in the air? Throughout most of the conflict, Russia has been cautious about risking aircraft losses. Notably, it has refrained from deploying its latest fifth-generation Su-57 Felon fighter jet over Ukrainian airspace. However, Russia's attitude in the deployment of its air force is now starting to change. According to Ukraine's Center for Defense Strategies think tank, the enemy has overcome the fear of using aviation directly over the battlefield, and although this results in the loss of aircraft, their ground forces gain a significant firepower advantage. CDS reports that Russia is increasingly utilizing aircraft to support operations on various fronts, including in the areas around the villages of Ivanivka, Bodanivka, and Hireivka in Donetsk Oblast. These operations involve the use of guided bombs from aircraft, helicopters, and heavy artillery, assisting in the movement of armored vehicles, some recently relocated from Avdiivka. Vuhledar, a small city in Donetsk Oblast, which has been a target of multiple unsuccessful Russian offensives, is witnessing intensified attacks, with additional troops deployed from Avdiivka. In these regions, especially from the east and northeast, Russian forces are now receiving more substantial air support than before. This strategy has led to the capture of the village of Popida and has potentially opened the road to Vuhledar, a development that merits close observation in the upcoming weeks. These shifts suggest a significant change in tactics on the Donbass front. Russian tanks and infantry, which had previously operated with limited air support, are now receiving more coordinated aerial backing in their offensive maneuvers. The increasing use of Russian aircraft closer to the battlefield opens a new branch in the ongoing war of attrition. How much damage can Russia's air force take in exchange for the gains the increased air support will give to Moscow's war effort? On paper, Russia should be able to take the punishment more than Ukraine. Before the war, it had the world's second largest number of combat aircraft between its military branches, with 4,182. Of these, about 900 were tactical aircraft. However, Russia cannot easily replace its losses in aircraft because of the sanctions imposed on it by technology-rich countries. Although Russia has adapted to sanctions and is producing vehicles and drones at what appears to be an adequate rate, this does not appear to be the case with aircraft. As of now, production rates in Russia amount to perhaps 24 new planes per year, according to David Axe of Forbes. One of the examples outlined in the report is with the fourth-generation Su-34 fighter jet. Russia had about 140 of these before the war, but has since lost 31. 109 thus remain. Russia cannot make up for these losses with its current production rates. Meanwhile, the new aircraft Russia can produce will likely have inferior systems due to the sanctions. The Oryx blog can provide some more details about the state of the air war. Oryx counts only visually confirmed losses, but it provides a reasonably accurate estimate of the overall situation. According to it, Russia has lost a total of 105 aircraft throughout the war as of March 2024, with 97 of them being destroyed and 8 damaged. In addition to the Su-34 fighters it has lost, Russia has lost 31 Su-25 close support aircraft, 14 Su-24 type aircraft, and 7 Su-35 fighter aircraft. The Su-35 is supposed to be Russia's most advanced fighter, other than the Su-57. Aside from these, Russia has lost a pair of Tu-22M3 strategic bombers, with 1 destroyed and 1 damaged on the ground. One Tu-95MS strategic bomber has also been damaged on the ground. 6 Il-76 transport aircraft have become casualties, with 3 destroyed, 2 damaged beyond repair, and 1 damaged on the ground. 1 AN-26 transport was destroyed in a non-combat related incident. 3 Il-22 airborne command posts have suffered as well, with 1 destroyed, 1 damaged beyond repair, and 1 damaged. Not only are these lost aircraft difficult to repair and replace, their inability to take to the skies puts additional pressure on Russia's existing aircraft. Fewer planes need to take on more responsibilities, increasing the wear and tear on their airframes, demand for dwindling spare parts, and fatigue on Russian pilots and crew chiefs. In a RAND Corporation report from August 2023, Michael Bonnet, a mechanical engineer working for the think tank, estimated that the extra hours the conflict has demanded on its aircraft has effectively cost Russia an additional 27 to 57 imputed plane losses. Aircraft have a lifespan. They are designed with a total number of expected flight hours, which are used roughly evenly over the life of the aircraft and segmented with periodic maintenance and inspection. For example, if an aircraft is designed for 3,000 flight hours with an expected use of 30 years, the aircraft will fly roughly 100 hours per year. If during an inspection, wear on the plane is found to be more or less than expected, the projected remaining hours are adjusted accordingly. These numbers dictate all sorts of planning, from fuel procurement to ground maintenance to pilot training. Imputed losses means that the Russians have burned through more of the expected lifespan of their aircraft more quickly than anticipated. To make up for it, they'll have to procure more aircraft, increase maintenance, reduce operations, or accept a smaller force, or some combination of those. Even in the early stages of the war, when the Russian Air Force was more cautious and at the height of its power, it was flying between 150 and 300 sorties per day, compared to the peacetime rate of about 60. Although Russia had decreased its sorties by becoming even more cautious in the face of unexpected Ukrainian resistance, it still flew about 100 sorties a day at the low mark. Now that number is increasing again, and the burden is concentrated on fewer aircraft. In August 2023, Bonner predicted that by the summer of 2024, the Russian Air Force would be below 75% of its pre-war strength due to the aircraft lost in combat or depletion through additional wear and tear. Bonner says that the Russian aerospace forces will need to either increase production, reduce usage, or reduce force structure for the next 30 years to make up for these losses, although he did note that the Russian Air Force was not in a horrible position despite the casualties. David Axe concludes that because of the increased wear and tear and the depletion of spare parts to keep planes in repair, the Russian Air Force might be down to about 700 effective combat aircraft. For now, Russia has the mass to sustain these losses, but soon it might have no choice but to become more cautious about deploying its aircraft into combat on the front again. The Ukrainians have another card to play, which should arrive on the battlefield this year. In August 2023, Ukraine finally got approval to use F-16 fighter jets, which it had desired since the beginning of the war. The initial delivery was slated for 42 planes, but it is possible that Ukraine could get over 60 F-16s. These F-16s will be faster and have better radar than the original F-16 from the early 1980s, and they will be a big improvement compared to the Soviet-era MiG-29 Ukraine currently operates as its standard aircraft. However, there is another big problem for Ukraine, as training the pilots and delivering the plane has taken precious time, and not all of the F-16s will arrive at once. 12 Ukrainian pilots are currently being taught to fly the F-16 in the United States. They are based at Morris Air National Guard Base in Tucson, Arizona, where their training started last October. The Arizona National Guard expects the pilots to graduate between May and August. Ukrainian pilots are also being trained in the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Romania. But while the pilots may be nearing the end of their training, there is still no word on when they and their planes will arrive on the battlefield. In February, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that it would be impossible to say when exactly the F-16s would arrive, because the planes not only need well-trained pilots, but the support crews and systems to keep them combat ready. Denmark's defense ministry said in January that the first 6 of the 19 F-16s it's donated to Ukraine would arrive there sometime in the second quarter of 2022. Yuri Inat, a press official for Ukraine's Air Force, said that the 6 pilots for those planes would be ready by spring. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba only confirmed that the F-16 will arrive into the war-torn country sometime later this year. According to him, 150 F-16s would be enough to secure Ukrainian airspace. So what do you think? Will the Ukrainians be able to defend their line against Russian air sorties before the F-16 arrives? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out why Russia is afraid of F-16s in Ukraine, or click this other video instead. And make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has cut an increasingly desperate figure in recent months. The war with Russia has entered its 3rd calendar year. The crucial city of Avdiivka has just fallen into enemy hands. A vital new military aid package from the US has been delayed in Congress. At no time in the conflict has the situation looked bleaker for the beleaguered Ukrainian people. In a report in the UK's Guardian newspaper from February 20th, Zelensky is quoted as saying that the situation is extremely difficult, an understatement or a tacit admission of defeat. Whichever way you interpret his words, the war looks to be slipping out of Kyiv's hands. But what if there was one piece of serious military hardware that could not only give Ukraine the edge over Russia, but do so within 24 hours? Pie in the sky? Wishful thinking? Maybe not. Enter the F-35 Lightning II fighter jet. But what's so special about this particular aircraft, and why could it play such a decisive and swift role in the conflict? According to Lockheed Martin, an American aerospace arms and defense corporation, the F-35 is the centerpiece of 21st century global security. The pilots who've flown the jet wholeheartedly agree. According to a report in Business Insider, Billy Flynn, a former Canadian lieutenant colonel and senior F-35 test pilot, told The Aviationist in April 2023 that the jet could play a key role in the conflict. The F-35 was designed precisely for an environment that we are seeing in Ukraine now. Principally funded by the US, the F-35 first flew in 2006 and entered full military service with the US Marine Corps in July 2015. But in terms of actual combat, the jet was first used in 2018 by the Israeli Air Force. To give you an idea of how highly the F-35 is regarded, the US plans to buy 2,456 jets by 2044. This will constitute the bulk of the crewed tactical aviation of the US Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps for several decades. Additionally, the aircraft will be a cornerstone of NATO and US allied air power and operate until 2070. It could easily be classed as the most sophisticated fighter jet in the world. Add 10+ years of combat experience into the mix and you'll get an even better idea of the difference it could make in the war in Ukraine. But perhaps the F-35's most potent ability is being able to link up and share target data with other ground, naval, and air units, meaning the enemy is facing 5 opponents instead of 1. Even without any upgrades, the F-35 outperforms other fighters in the US fleet. It's been proven to defeat adversary aircraft in exercises by a truly stunning 20-to-1 margin. Better still, it accomplishes a broader array of tasks, and it's easier to maintain than other fighter jets. By some distance, it's the most reliable tactical aircraft in the Joint Fleet. So the jet most certainly has an impressive pedigree, but what exactly does the F-35 Lightning II bring to the table in terms of combat capabilities, and how could it provide the crucial air dominance Ukraine wants over Russia? A multi-role stealth aircraft, this jet has been designed for air superiority and strike missions. Equipped with a powerful electronic warfare and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance suite, it offers the ultimate in aerial firepower. Just as importantly, the F-35 can gather and distribute real-time battlefield information to friendly forces that we just mentioned. Its weapon capabilities are potentially devastating and incredibly versatile. In a configuration known as Beast Mode, it carries 4 500-pound GBU-12 laser-guided bombs on its wings, 2 GBU-12 in its internal weapons bay, and an AIM-9 air-to-air heat-seeking missile. And while that may mean sacrifices in stealth for firepower, we're still looking at a very dangerous piece of equipment. Moreover, the F-35's ability to enhance the capabilities of friendly aircraft would be invaluable in the conflict in Ukraine. Why? The jet excels in highly contested airspace and would be far more effective than the F-16s that have already been deployed to the area and will be deployed in greater numbers later in the year. Particularly adept against surface-to-air missile systems and other ground defenses, it will easily destroy them and any enemy aircraft to achieve air dominance. How? The aircraft's stealth profile. These capabilities are crucial to the aircraft's effectiveness, never more so than in any potential deployment in Ukraine. The F-35-2 was designed for wars where the front lines are contested with surface-to-air missile radars, SAMs. Granted, Russia has powerful SAMs, only they can't be deployed near the front lines. Another tick in the box for the F-35-2. If nothing else, the Ukraine conflict has shown just how vulnerable fourth-generation aircraft are to air defenses that are 40+ years old and even considered antiquated by some armed forces. Russia has been deploying SAMs in Belarus, Crimea, as well as in the Donbass and Kherson region, effectively covering large parts of Ukrainian airspace. For that reason, Ukrainian pilots have been restricted to flying over grasslands, highways, and treetops throughout the conflict to avoid detection. That's why the F-35 would be so effective in not just heading a bombing campaign from the outset, but also routine air-to-air and air-ground sorties. The bottom line, the aircraft can strike wherever and whenever needed. The result, air dominance, maybe within as little as 24 hours. Make no mistake, air dominance is one thing, but the F-35 would also be crucial in helping Ukrainian forces regain lost territories and ultimately banish the Russians from their soil once and for all. For many, however, the ace up the sleeve for the F-35 is in terms of pure kinematics. In attrition warfare, where each aircraft has a clear view of the other, it's simply a matter of whoever launches the missile first will win the battle. In a low observable F-35, however, the aircraft wouldn't be seen by the enemy fighter jet. Therefore, the pilot can shoot a missile before the adversary is aware of its existence. For that reason, it would eliminate the need to play the kind of kinematic tactics that have been a part of aerial combat through all the years of 3rd generation and 4th generation weapons and fighters. So how would the F-35 fare against its Russian counterpart, the Su-30? While both are advanced fighter jets, the F-35 is more designed for air-to-air and air-to-ground combat. In comparison, the Su-30 is a highly maneuverable and agile 4th generation fighter, designed to be in dogfights, close-run engagements, with ultimate deployment and strategy perhaps being the deciding factor, but we'll discuss the more tactical side of Russia's Air Force plan later in the video. And there's more. Once air dominance is achieved, backup aircraft like the F-16 could provide additional firepower against ground troops, with the all-singing and all-dancing F-35 patrolling the skies to protect them. Potentially, it could have played a decisive role in the battle for Avdiivka. With aerial support of this magnitude, the key town in the Donbass region would likely not have fallen into Russian hands. Theoretically, therefore, as few as 4 F-35s could provide air superiority over a limited area, such as the skies in Ukraine. In a report in Air and Space Forces magazine, Air Force General Todd D. Walters, who also serves as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, concurred with that theory. He said that getting more F-35s to Europe, either as part of the US Air Force or for other nations, is critical. More specifically, he claimed, they'll deliver a tremendous improvement in strategic ability, in indications and warnings, command and control, and mission command. Now, all of this might sound incredible. If Zelensky's allies want to bring an end to the war as quickly as possible, then the F-35 too has the tools to do the job. But wars are never straightforward affairs to conduct, and most importantly to finance. By the same token, it's in nobody's interest for the conflict to drag on and on into 2025 and beyond. With that in mind, what is the likelihood of Ukraine receiving the 4 F-35s it needs to achieve dominance over its own airspace? The answer to that question is complex, manifold, and ultimately out of Zelensky's hands. But perhaps the most pertinent factor to consider is how much one of these miracle fighter jets actually costs. Well, if you were shopping for just a single F-35 Lightning II, it would set you back around the $109 million mark. But you would get plenty of choice and bang for your buck. There are 3 options with different operating abilities available: conventional takeoff and landing, F-35A, short takeoff and vertical landing, F-35B, and a variant designed for aircraft carrier operations, F-35C. But of course, there is so much more to fighter jet deployment than just the cost of one aircraft. According to Simply Flying, the overall project cost of the F-35 program has increased from an initial $200 billion to over $400 billion, with an estimated lifetime cost of $1.7 trillion. And this perhaps brings us to the crux of the issue. Since the invasion in February 2022, Ukraine has received huge military aid packages from the West. According to a CNN report, that figure is around $350 billion. According to stats from the New York Times, the European Union collectively has provided about $148.5 billion in assistance since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Crazy, mind-boggling numbers. But even with the best will in the world and the greatest of intentions, financial support of that kind can't go on forever. No matter how big or powerful a nation or collective of nations, their coffers are not a bottomless pit. Hence the wrangling in the US Congress we touched upon at the top of the video. So that very much leaves Ukraine's Western allies with a risk and reward scenario to weigh up. Go all in with Zelensky and supply him with F-35s, or supply less effective hardware and watch the conflict drag on. Encouragingly, they can look to the start of the conflict. Before a single shell was fired, Western officials predicted that Russia would enjoy the kind of air supremacy it enjoyed in the large-scale airstrikes in the Syrian war. But failure on the first day of the Russians to destroy the Ukrainian air defense facilities has hampered Moscow's invasion strategy, a senior Western intelligence official told The Times. In terms of numbers, it didn't make pretty reading for the Ukrainians. At the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine was believed to have around 120 combat-capable aircraft, mainly consisting of aging Soviet-era MiG-29s and Su-27s. To match Moscow's firepower, which is thought to be 5 to 6 times greater than Kyiv's, they needed up to 200 jets. Without a doubt, the battle for the skies has been one of the more curious and certainly most crucial subplots of the war. According to a CNN report from 2022, the Russian Air Force had a massive advantage in terms of overall hardware. To give you a more detailed breakdown, Russia's 1,391 aircraft to Ukraine's 132, complemented by 948 helicopters to Kyiv's 55, was capable of the kind of aerial dominance required to end Ukraine's resistance. But for whatever reason, botched Russian tactics being the most popular and persuasive explanation, it simply didn't happen. It's also worth noting that Russia's overall defense budget of $45.8 billion is almost 10 times that of its neighbor. There's more. Russia had roughly 300 military aircraft stationed around the borders of the country, but has used few in the invasion so far. Instead, Russia has used attack helicopters and some short-range fighters, but made very limited use of long-range attack aircraft and bombers. Why is a question that has beguiled many military experts. One reason may be that Russia is not confident they destroyed Ukraine's air defenses and are not confident they can send fighters overhead without losing them, said another senior military figure. Given the F-35's undoubted capabilities, coupled with its suitability for this kind of conflict, air dominance could perhaps be achieved in Ukraine with relative ease. So, are financial constraints the main thing working against Zelensky then? To answer that question, we need to look at the bigger picture. Logistically, supplying the Ukraine with fighter jets isn't the most straightforward of processes. Why? Training. It's believed that Ukraine has 50 pilots who could start training them on Western jets immediately. However, preparing them to fly warplanes takes time. Just as importantly, it removes them from current fighting duties. And with the fall of such a crucial and symbolically important city as Avdiivka, Zelensky would be very reluctant to withdraw experienced fighters from the front line. To address this issue, the British government has offered to train Ukrainian pilots on NATO standard aircraft. This comes with a depressing caveat, however, as it's clearly a longer-term option. Training pilots could take months or even years, especially considering the complexity of the modern fighter jet. But encouragingly, British officials think the training process could be ramped up for some of Ukraine's more seasoned pilots with years of experience flying Soviet-era jet planes. Not the greatest news for Zelensky, but not a disaster by any means. However, the training issue also rears its ugly head in terms of maintenance. To keep a jet like the F-35-2 airborne requires complex and specialized engineering. Dr. Jamie Scheer, formerly of NATO, told the BBC that fifth-generation fighter jets require extensive maintenance following almost every flight. Again, Ukraine just doesn't have the personnel on the ground with the kind of experience needed to keep their prospective F-35s in the air. Again, it's important to note that air superiority isn't just about the number of aircraft you have in the skies. It also involves a variety of factors such as tactics and support systems. Invariably, military operations are complex and dynamic, and it's impossible to predict the outcome of any engagement with certainty. Once again, you need experienced people on the ground coordinating your aerial attacks, not just maintaining your hardware. Essential considerations that will not have been overlooked by Zelensky's allies. When multi-million-dollar aircraft are involved, decisions need to be weighed carefully. But it must be stated, the F-35 isn't the only fighter jet in the world that could assist the Ukrainian war effort against the Russian aggressors. At the time of writing for this video, Ukraine is due to receive a significant shipment of F-16 fighters from the West in the spring. Yuri Anat, the spokesperson of the Airforce Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, estimated that the country needed between 100 and 200 jets to defend its airspace. According to a report in the New York Times from back in August of 2023, the Netherlands and Denmark joined the US in pledging to donate some jets to the Ukrainian cause, all of which prompted Zelensky to post on messaging app Telegram a breakthrough agreement. From today, there are already specifics. They will be in the Ukrainian sky, thank you. Even so, there are deeper divisions and retinence that have opened up since Putin's invasion. Not just in the United States, but throughout the Western world, there is an increasing sense of war weariness. Even those who passionately supported Zelensky during the first few months of the conflict look to have had a change of heart. Gradually, people have started to realize that the massive military aid packages that their governments are providing are doing nothing more than prolonging the conflict. Citizens are tired of turning on their televisions and seeing bombed-out shells of buildings and dead bodies piled up in the streets. A catch-22 situation, if ever there was one. If enough people think that doing the right thing is having the wrong outcome, it puts yet another obstacle in Zelensky's path. All of which begs the question, what next? Some experts have advocated a negotiated peace settlement. In a report obtained by Newsweek, there have been calls for the US to play a more significant role in facilitating the process. The paper, published by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, disputes the idea that diplomacy is entirely untenable. However, that claim does have a chilling caveat. The authors believe that the view that a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine is neither possible nor desirable is false. It's also extremely dangerous for Ukraine's future. The war is not trending toward a stable stalemate, but toward Ukraine's eventual collapse. But if the whispering coming out of Moscow, or more correctly, the bullish posturing Putin displayed in his interview with Tucker Carlson, are to be believed, any peace deal would be so heavily loaded in Russia's favor, Zelensky would never put pen to paper in a million years. A more likely scenario is continued hostilities and further loss of life, even if 2024 is more of a year of consolidation for both sides rather than all-out offensives. Who would be happier with that outcome is obvious. With the fall of Avdiivka and 20% of Ukrainian territory in his back pocket, Putin looks happy to play the long game. Wait and see what Zelensky and the West come up with next. The battle of air dominance was thought to be a key factor in the war itself, and while that hasn't quite happened as yet, there is no doubt that the introduction of a fighter jet like the F-35 would make Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin very nervous indeed. Ultimately, such an aircraft could make all the difference in Ukraine's war with Russia. With its advanced electronic warfare and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance suite, it would give them the upper hand in the air and essential support for ground troops. In terms of aerial firepower, we've already talked about its 4 500-pound GBU-12 laser-guided bombs on its wings, the 2 GBU-12 in its internal weapons bay, and the AIM-9 air-to-air heat-seeking missile. And the ability to gather and distribute real-time battlefield information to friendly forces would enable troops to coordinate decisive offensives and counter-offensives far more effectively. But all of this must be tempered with a solid dose of military and economic reality. History teaches us that it's not always the biggest or best equipped army that wins the war. The will and determination of the people embroiled in the conflict have often proven to be the determining factor. But as mentioned, perhaps the biggest conundrum facing the West is whether prolonging the war will not only be counterproductive to their collective goals, but come at too much of a cost in terms of human life. Granted, it is well within Biden's and all the other Western leaders' capabilities to supply Ukraine with enough F-35 jets to gain air dominance over Russia in a super quick time. But will it bring a swift end to the conflict? Now we're coming to the end of the video, it's time to ask you what you think about the current situation in Ukraine. Do you think the deployment of the F-35 Lightning II could help Ukraine deal a fatal blow to Russia? Would establishing air dominance be a crucial factor in the outcome of the war? And if that's the case, would it make sense for NATO, the US, and the rest of Zelensky's allies to act now in an attempt to put a swift end to the conflict? Or are you on the other side of the fence? Taking into account Biden's reluctance to supply Ukraine with fighter jets 2 years ago, is there any realistic chance of Ukraine being supplied with state-of-the-art military hardware now? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis from military experts. Question: what do coral reefs and much of the Russian Black Sea Fleet have in common? Answer: they're both endangered species and increasingly make for breathtaking underwater tourist attractions. Sure, maybe it's low-hanging fruit, but all jokes aside, Russia only has itself to blame for the current state of its once impressive navy, which most people, Putin included, thought would steamroll Ukraine when they invaded their neighbor in 2022. Ukraine, after all, did not technically even have a navy in the strict sense of the word. First impressions, however, can be deceiving. Over the last 2 years, Russia has managed to lose a combined total of approximately 16 ships and submarines, including the crown jewel of its Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class cruiser Moskva, sunk by a pair of land-based Neptune anti-ship missiles. These are incredibly steep losses for an alleged great power, especially when you consider that most of the others were sunk by Ukrainian-designed, unmanned maritime drones packed to the rafters with explosives. These ingenious and relatively cheap systems, about $250,000 a pop, have become symbolic of Ukraine's technological savviness and innovative approach to naval warfare. Their asymmetric campaign has resulted in Russia's transformation from the indisputable maritime power in the Black Sea, on paper at least, to being pinned back into the eastern portion and unable to exert sea control over the region. Ordinarily, a military power with as much money, means, and manpower as Russia would double down on the omnipresent threat to its expensive naval assets. If the United States Navy were tasked with defending the Black Sea, it's easy to envision the strategy it would employ. One of its 11 carrier strike groups would almost undoubtedly be deployed to the region, which consists of an aircraft carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers for air defense, 2 LAMPS-capable warships for anti-submarine and surface warfare, and a pair of anti-submarine destroyers or frigates. The fleet would largely be insulated from traditional and hypersonic missile threats with robust and advanced cooperative engagement capabilities, DEW technology, and long-range interceptor missile technology. With enough support ships supplying munitions, fuel, and other supplies, carrier combat aircraft could conduct electronic warfare, hunt for enemy drones, and engage the bases from which they are launched almost indefinitely until the threat was entirely neutralized. US naval assets possess superior radar and electronic warfare suites to down drones, Phalanx CIWS automated guns with 20mm Vulcan cannons, and Skynex-type airburst munitions to engage close-in surface threats and drone swarms, and helicopter-launched missiles to wipe out any drone boats that made it through the fleet's wide defensive perimeter. It would almost be overkill, and the modern US military knows almost no other way. So, why doesn't Russia follow suit? Why not deploy its own aircraft carrier to the Black Sea to help neutralize the Ukrainian maritime fleet of what, in essence, amounts to a bunch of plastic water skis with a GoPro, smartphone, and a big boomstick attached to it? The answer is that it can't. The Russian carrier, known as the Admiral Flotta Sovetskogo Soyuza Kuznetsov, or Admiral Kuznetsov for short, has been undergoing a series of refittings and repairs that have relegated it to dry dock for the past few years. Though it was rumored to be ready to re-enter service by the end of 2024, experts are now wondering whether the carrier will ever sail again. Whatever its future, the vessel won't find itself anywhere near the Black Sea Fleet, or any Russian fleet for that matter, in the near or foreseeable future. Today, we're going to talk about why. If you want to measure a nation's true global power, it's often said that the best way is to look at its navy. But why? Naval vessels are expensive to produce and maintain. Only the richest nations with resources to spare can shoulder the cost of developing, testing, and projecting naval assets across the globe. As the most expensive and complex naval vessel, the modern aircraft carrier is, for good reason, almost universally viewed as the pinnacle of naval power. Those who have them can bring their bombs to bear in almost any corner of the world. Those that don't are forever doomed to the perennial role of a regional power. The history of Russia suggests that it should be at least on par with some of the world's most powerful nations at sea today. Of all Russia's service branches, the Soviet Navy was the fastest to expand after World War II. It had 421 ships of 8 different types, although these figures may be considerably larger. Its submarine fleet was world-renowned, and commensurate with its newfound status as a global power, the Soviets started to employ their navy much like the United States, to project power not just in their own geopolitical neighborhood, but around the world. From the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Arctic to the Pacific, Soviet vessels could be found performing anti-submarine, anti-ship, and anti-aircraft operations throughout the Cold War. The Soviets owed much of their post-1945 naval renaissance to the reforms of one man, Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, who argued for specialized missile-armed ships and submarines instead of more traditional battleships and heavy cruisers well ahead of his time. With the seizure of East German shipyards, laboratories, and industries in 1945, Kuznetsov started to turn his vision into reality. He's widely credited for having pressed the Soviets to experiment with hydrofoils, sound-seeking torpedoes, radars, sonars, guided missiles, and other advanced propulsion techniques that kept them apace with American technological advances, and in addition, for elevating the Russian Navy onto equal terms with the General Staff of the Ground Forces, thus setting up the Soviet Union for better joint coordination and strategic success for much of the Cold War. The Soviets adhered to a simple naval strategy at the time. They prioritized nuclear second strike capabilities and then used bombers, submarines, and large surface vessels to threaten NATO's sea lines of communication in the North Atlantic. By the 1970s, rapid advances in Soviet submarine, missile, and nuclear technology enabled them to challenge the United States' previously unquestioned naval supremacy for the first time. It took until 1985, however, for the Soviet Union to build its first aircraft carrier. Built by Black Sea Shipyard in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, the Admiral Kuznetsov was officially commissioned in January 1991 and became fully operational in 1995. After the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, however, everything started to unravel. The Soviet Navy originally intended to launch a sister ship, the Varyag, but the project was disbanded in 1991, where after its incomplete and stripped hull was sold by Ukraine to China, who rebuilt the Varyag as the Liaoning, the People's Liberation Army Navy's first ever aircraft carrier. The Kuznetsov was launched at a time of unprecedented geopolitical turnover and massive budget cuts. It was fatefully marked for an inauspicious future from the start of its turbulent service history. In 1991, Ukraine officially declared its independence from the Soviet Union. That year, acting Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev thwarted a coup attempt by communist hardliners to seize control of the country's political affairs. Gorbachev envisioned a more open, decentralized Soviet government with power distributed among the nation's 15 republics. His reforms may have rubbed the old guard of communist conservatives the wrong way, but they inspired nations like Ukraine, long held under the yoke of Soviet oppression, to exert themselves in foreign affairs. Accordingly, the same year, Ukraine's first elected president, Leonid Kravchuk, told the commander of the Kuznetsov, Viktor Yarygin, that the vessel was Ukraine's rightful property. Kravchuk ordered Yarygin to keep the ship in Sevastopol until the Ukrainian government could figure out what to do. Unfortunately for Kravchuk, Russian naval commander Yuri Ustimenko swooped in and ordered the ship's crew to sail to Russian waters so it could remain in the Soviet fleet. To this day, many Ukrainians still feel the Kuznetsov was unjustly stolen from them. In reality, they may have dodged a bullet. The ship has hung like a broken-down albatross around the neck of the Russian Navy ever since, becoming far more of a burden than a blessing. Before we get into the comically tragic tale of the Kuznetsov's modern service history, let's cover the basics. Relative to modern standards, and especially compared to the nuclear-powered American supercarriers like the Nimitz-class or Ford-class vessels, the Admiral Kuznetsov is modest, unwieldy, and inefficient, and that's putting it mildly. It is 1,000 feet long. It has a 236-foot beam and a 23-foot draft, and displaces 58,000 tons when fully loaded. Steam turbines, turbo-pressurized boilers, 4 shafts, and 4 fixed-pitch propellers drive the vessel through the water, each producing 2,011 horsepower. The ship has a maximum speed of 29 knots. By comparison, the Ford-class carrier, which has unlimited range, displaces double the weight, or 100,000 tons, holds double the aircraft and well over twice the crew, and is over 30 meters longer, can still travel 1 knot faster. The power generated by the Ford-class's 2 A1B nuclear reactors generate 250% more electrical capacity than the Nimitz-class carriers, enabling them to keep pace with far smaller vessels. The Kuznetsov does not run on nuclear power and has a maximum range of 9,800 miles and operational deployment time of 45 days before it must return to port. In their infinite wisdom, when the Soviets laid the keel of their lone carrier, they decided it would run on mazut, an outdated petrochemical that hasn't been used regularly for 50 years. Once seen as an eminently viable fuel for naval energy because of its high volume-to-energy ratio, it was soon found not only to be environmentally unsound, but dangerous for the ship's own crew. Mazut, you see, is incredibly vicious and tar-like. When burned, it emits a cloying, dense cloud of black smoke that clings to sailors' clothing and skin. In 2017, the vessel gained global notoriety when Britain's then Defense Secretary Michael Fallon dubbed it the Ship of Shame, as it passed through the waters close to the English coast, belching black smoke. So what exactly can the Kuznetsov do when it isn't in port topping off its fuel tanks with fresh batches of mazut? On paper, the carrier can carry 18 Su-33s, 6 MiG-29Ks, 4 Ka-31s, and 2 Ka-27s. It's designed to sail alone, and as a result, carries greater firepower than her US counterparts, who rely on escort vessels for mutual protection. Its armaments include 12 SSN-19 shipwreck, long-range high-speed sea-skimming SSMs, 24 VLS units loaded with 192 SAN-9 Gauntlet SAMs, and 8 Kashtan CIWS with dual 30mm machine guns, and 8 AK-630 CIWS. Compared to the 4 Phalanx CIWS and 4 Sea Sparrow launchers, each with 8 missiles carried by the Nimitz class, Admiral Kuznetsov is well armed for both air defense and offensive operations against hostile shipping. The problem, as you'll see later, is merely getting and maintaining the ship in the fight, not the fight itself. The way the Kuznetsov launches its aircraft is perhaps the most recognizable design feature, or flaw, depending on who you ask. Rather than utilize a modernized steam catapult to hurl heavily laden aircraft into the air off the carrier deck at breakneck speed, the Kuznetsov utilizes an old-school bow ramp. You know, the type of thing you and your friends built in grade school to launch your bike into the air in your front yard. The chief flaw of the bow ramp is that it supposes severe limitations on the types of payloads you can launch, which, in turn, constrains the types of missions you can conduct. Physics and gravity exert more of an influence on unassisted bow ramp launch operations. Consequently, the Kuznetsov's crew must adhere to strict takeoff weight limitations, which restrict the amount of ordnance and fuel a jet can carry, and in turn, reduces the jet's offensive effectiveness and range. When the carrier launched in 1995, Russian naval officers were optimistic that the Kuznetsov, deployed in tandem with their powerful submarines, might be able to help their nation remain a major global sea power, even as the country navigated its uncertain future. It didn't take long for fate to take its course. On its first deployment to the Mediterranean in 1996, the carrier was anchored off the port of Tartus, Syria, to conduct its first set of continuous flight operations. At one point during the mission, the carrier's evaporators broke down, stranding thousands of Russian sailors aboard with no fresh water. It was the start of an almost endless stream of technical, mechanical, and engineering issues. Over the next 20 years, Admiral Kuznetsov conducted a series of additional deployments and demonstrations in the Mediterranean, North Sea, Barents Sea, the Atlantic, and the Black Sea. Working with other Russian surface ships, it was pretty common to see the carrier involved in large-scale exercises, rescue operations, escort missions, and naturally, extensive maintenance whenever something broke or needed revitalization. In 2005, one of the carrier's Su-33 aircraft accidentally fell off the back into the Atlantic, one of the first indicators of the vessel's accident-prone reputation. 4 years later, a short circuit sparked a small fire aboard the ship while it was anchored off the Turkish coast. Carbon monoxide poisoning led to the death of one Russian sailor. Just a month later, the carrier found itself in the middle of a massive oil spill that resulted when it tried to refuel at sea with several other Russian vessels off the southern coast of Ireland. The crew was very grateful to return to dry dock for scheduled repairs over the next year. It was business as usual for 2 more years before the next incident struck. In February 2012, after a long, meandering journey around the tip of Scotland and into the Mediterranean, the Admiral Kuznetsov lost propulsion and set adrift in the Bay of Biscay on its return to its home base of Severomorsk. Embarrassingly, the carrier had to be towed the 2,700 miles back to Russia by tugboat, a gesture symbolic of the ship's next decade of service. It would not return to the high seas until 2014, having conducted just 6 overseas patrols across its 23-year lifespan thus far. Still, Russian naval officials were optimistic by the mid-2010s that despite strict financial constraints and recurring technical glitches, the Kuznetsov could remain operational well into the 2030s. Theirs was an incredibly rose-colored prognosis. By 2016, when the carrier set to sea en route to the Mediterranean, it had to be accompanied by 7 other vessels, including an ocean-going tugboat as a precaution due to potential propulsion failure. It pretty much always goes out with a tugboat, noted Dmitry Gorenberg, a senior research scientist in the Strategy, Policy, Plans and Programs division of the CNA. It's in extremely poor material condition, he added. The pilots are not proficient at all, they don't spend enough time at sea. Another popular military blog at the time put it more succinctly, calling the ship a piece of crap. And, well, they were right. In late 2016, things got pretty dire for the old admiral. Though its carrier air wing had been upgraded with the latest and greatest Russian multi-role aircraft and naval attack helicopters, its latest deployment to the Mediterranean suffered from a shortage of trained pilots, which limited the amount of fixed-wing aircraft it could launch at any given moment. As the carrier group approached the eastern coast of Crete, one of its MiG-29Ks took off from the carrier and returned as planned, only to find the Kuznetsov's deck crews were frantically repairing a broken arresting cable. The carrier commander, with plenty of time to divert the aircraft to a nearby airbase, dithered in the hopes his crew could fix the problem in time. Well, they couldn't. While circling the carrier, the plane ran out of fuel, forcing the pilot to eject into the sea. 2 weeks later, the Kuznetsov participated in its first ever combat operations, launching a series of Su-33 strikes against ISIS in Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry pointed out that the strikes were responsible for killing at least 30 enemy militants, including top field commanders. But Kuznetsov simply couldn't stay out of the news. A week later, another Su-33 crashed into the sea attempting to land on the carrier. The culprit? That darned arresting cable. It turns out it had been damaged even more than the technicians thought in the latest landing attempt. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The carrier's air wing was transferred ashore to continue ongoing military operations, Meanwhile, in early 2017, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that the Kuznetsov would cease all operations in Syria, return to Russia, and begin a long-needed modernization program to overhaul its technical systems and extend its service by 25 years. This is where things get even more weird. You see, when ships go into dry dock for extensive upgrades, things are supposed to be safer. The environment is controlled, refittings occur on predictable, tight schedules, and crews have access to all the cranes, tools, and equipment they need to do their job properly in an ideal world. And so the Kuznetsov arrived at PD-50, one of the world's largest floating dry docks located at the 82nd Repair Shipyard in the village of Rosolyakovo, serving Russia's northern fleet based out of the neighboring port of Severomorsk, to have an invasive checkup. In the autumn of 2018, fate, karma, bad luck, or whatever you want to call it, again interrupted the Kuznetsov's regularly scheduled programming when the entire dry dock suddenly convulsed and sank into the sea, collapsing cranes onto the carrier's deck and sending shipyard workers scrambling for their lives. Somewhere along the line, the pump system that controlled the dry dock's buoyancy lost power, flooding its ballast tanks with water far in excess of their maximum point. 4 dock workers were wounded, another went missing. While certain Russian officials claimed the Kuznetsov was undamaged in the incident, other outlets were quick to report that there was now a 5-meter gash in the hull of the ship around the waterline and that the deck was supposedly opened up with intricate machinery exposed when the crane fell on it. Much to the Navy's consternation, the industrial accident looked set to delay the Kuznetsov's refit longer than anticipated. And then, a year later, in 2019, the ship caught fire again. Though Russia no longer possessed a dry dock large enough to accommodate a vessel of that size after the sinking of PD-50, it had stubbornly pressed on with the tortured refit when a fire broke out during repairs to the first power unit, sending a thick plume of black smoke into the sky as burning diesel fuel and power cables caused a thick cloud of acrid black smoke to fill the ship's cramped corridors and increase the engulfed area 6-fold to 120 square meters. This estimate made by the Russian TASS news outlet was said to be well short of the mark. Other agencies posited that the blaze covered up to 600 square meters. 8 repairmen had to be rescued from the inferno, 1 remained unaccounted for. Most blame the fire on safety violations. It would be par for the course. The fire damage cost an estimated $8 million, although some sources cite that number may be higher. The Kuznetsov by this point had already become the brunt of international jokes in the press and military circles. Its embarrassing overhaul was only adding insult to injury. Repairs were delayed through 2021, with Russian officials citing bad weather as the chief cause. Okay, it took until May 2022 to return the ship to a new dry dock built in Murmansk after the sinking of the PD-50. When it finally drained in July 2022, repairs continued in earnest. That is until December 2022, when the ship caught fire again. In Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a man at sea inexplicably shoots an enormous seabird that had been flying alongside his vessel for several days. As the bird died, the wind immediately ceased blowing. Irate with the mariner and fully convinced the bird had magically made the wind blow, his crew made him wear the albatross around his neck until it rotted. A heavy burden that acted as a constant reminder of his senseless decision. By this point in the Admiral Kuznetsov's long life, an honest reading of the past 30 years would seem to indicate that the vessel, much like the mariner's albatross, is an unnecessary burden around Russia's neck. Russia seems to be blithely ignoring the chronic shortcomings, tragic losses, and damaged prestige incurred by the vessel's poor design. They remained committed to getting the ship operational sometime in 2023. Now things are looking as bad as ever as the ship, like the Albatross, seems to be decomposing at the 35th Ship Repair Plant in Murmansk. A recent defense intelligence report indicated that even at this late stage of its refitting, the ship could not relocate from the dry dock to one of the repair plant's piers under its own power, but that it still had to be pulled by a series of several tugs. They tried and failed to move the hulking steel mass owing to the critical condition of the ship's hull. Examinations to the hull revealed that the metal structures below the third deck of the ship were significantly corroded. The holds are filled with muddy water, which makes it impossible to examine the ship in detail from the inside. Today, repairmen are warning the Russian military to deploy the Kuznetsov at their own risk. Its condition, they argue, leaves it with a high probability that it would sink or capsize. Russian naval officials, repairmen, and defense contractors are now hurling blame at one another for the vessel's dismal bill of health. Now nobody knows whether the Kuznetsov will be able to return to service in 2024 or not. This all begs the question, if it's more trouble than it's worth, why doesn't Russia simply scuttle the ship? It all goes back to the way Russia hopes the world perceives it as a global and not a regional naval power. For decades, Russia has been in the process of modernizing its surface fleet with larger numbers of smaller, technologically advanced vessels. Yet it has doggedly clung to many of its older, larger units, vestiges of the Soviet era when it was truly on the brink of becoming a major sea power. Just as Ukraine's sinking of the Moskva in April 2022 was viewed globally as an attack on Russia's perception of itself as a sea power, one expert has observed that scrapping the Kuznetsov would be akin to scrapping the idea of Russia being a great sea power. This, put simply, is just not on the cards for Russia's current cast of leaders. Today, Russia can't afford to build any new large warships of consequence. Until it achieves its long-term strategic goals in Ukraine, this trend looks set to continue for the foreseeable future. In the interim, the Russian Navy will be forced to maintain and modernize its current fleet, so even though its lone carrier is prone to spontaneous combustion, puts its crew in undue danger, remains reliant on external tugs for propulsion, and occasionally forces its pilots to eject at sea, it is and will remain the golden child of the Russian fleet until its leaders see the writing on the wall. Now go and check out why all Russian weapons are a failure, or click this other video instead. As tank, artillery and air battles rage across eastern Ukraine, on a scale not seen since the Second World War, Europe and America have reacted with alarm, scrambling to provide money, advice, weapons, and ammunition to support the Ukrainian army. Russia has thrown thousands of tanks and armored combat vehicles into the war. High on the wish list of Ukrainian President Zelensky's generals was always the M1A2 Abrams main battle tank. On 25th of January 2023, US President Joe Biden announced that 31 Abrams tanks would be sent to Ukraine. But how will a tank that was designed in the 1970s and first fielded in the mid-1980s fare against significantly upgraded Russian tanks in the third decade of the 21st century? Is Vladimir Putin right to be terrified of the M1 Abrams? Let's crunch some of the numbers and get a sense of where the Abrams comes from, what it can do, how it might make an impact on the battlefields of Ukraine, and why Vladimir Putin should be afraid. To understand the birth of the Abrams and its current variant, the M1A2, we need to go right back to the Cold War, between 1945 and 1990, where NATO and the Soviet Union were squaring up against each other in Central Europe. Throughout these decades, the most likely conflict between the two sides seemed to be a massive ground war fought in West Germany. In the 1970s, the main American battle tank, the M60, was becoming obsolete. A replacement was needed, one that was designed for high mobility in modern armored ground warfare and that could defeat the latest generation of Soviet armor. Some early US-German collaboration looked at producing a tank together. The Germans were also looking to replace the Leopard 1, but this MBT-70 program was expensive and the tank design problematic. American designers started again. In 1973, at the heart of the requirements for a new tank were that it could survive a strike by a Soviet tank gun at 800 meters and mount a 105mm main armament. Proposals came in from Chrysler and General Motors. There were several issues to be considered. The Chrysler proposal had a gas turbine engine, while the General Motors design offered a diesel. This had implications for cost and reliability. In the mid-1970s, there was considerable interest in a new British defensive composite armor innovation called Cobham armor, which through a clever and highly classified technique of layering ceramic tiles and open spaces in such a way as to channel, deflect, and dissipate the intense heat and impact of an anti-tank round. Although early models of the new tank design that would become the Abrams M1 mounted a 105mm gun, it was soon clear that a 120mm would be much more potent. The armored warfare doctrine of the time emphasized being able to strike the enemy at long range before he could get in a first shot. It seems that for most of the evaluation process, the General Motors demonstration model was favored. However, at the last minute, the decision was overturned by then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who wanted to hear all the arguments again. He finally decided in favor of the Chrysler version. There may have been a bit of DC politics involved. The M1 tank acquired an official name Abrams, after General Creighton Abrams, a former tank commander in Patton's Third Army in the Second World War, and who had worked hard in the 1960s and 70s to push forward US main battle tank design. The original M1 Abrams tank came into service in 1980. Over 3,000 were produced between 1979 and 1985, many with a 105mm gun. But a few years later, the M1 was being replaced by an upgraded version, the M1A1. These all had a 120mm main gun. Nearly 5,000 M1A1s were produced between 1986 and 1992, 4,000 for the American Army and 400 for the US Marines. Each tank cost over $4 million. The Abrams has a crew of 4 and weighs 57 tons, although different models can weigh as much as 78 tons. It can reach speeds of 67 km an hour and has a range of 465 km. The M829A2 armor-piercing shell can deal with newer Russian tanks, the T-80 and T-90, which have Contact 5 explosive reactive armor, ERA. In addition to the 120mm main armament, the Abrams mounts a coaxial machine gun and a 50 caliber heavy machine gun on top of the turret. The Abrams is heavier than most current main battle tanks and it's bulky, but it's also quite agile. One nickname it has acquired is Whispering Death, because the gas turbine engine is relatively quiet. The Abrams also had a lot of safety features designed specifically to protect the crew. Crew survivability has always been an important part of the Abrams design concept. The crew is always the most precious asset of any tank, so the tank ammunition is stored in the back compartment of the tank turret and carefully sealed away from the crew. This has turned out to be a vital design innovation. Social media is now full of clips of Russian tanks in Ukraine catastrophically exploding, their turrets flung up into the air because the ammunition is stored, unprotected, in the crew compartment. The M1A1 has improved defenses. Now the composite armor also includes screens of heavy depleted uranium and twin sets of smoke discharges. Some models have anti-missile jamming measures. The rear of the turret has blowout panels to redirect blast in the event of ammunition explosions. The crew interior has Kevlar lining around the turret to protect against spalling, which is caused when high-velocity rounds strike the outside of the tank and cause fragments of metal to flake off at high speed and bounce around inside the tank. This thing is combat-proven. Here's what we mean. The M1 Abrams crews spent years of training during the 1980s in the wooded, mountainous, and population-heavy arena of Germany as they prepared to conduct defensive operations against a Soviet assault. It was highly ironic, therefore, that the Abrams' first actual combat deployment was in an offensive role in the unpopulated deserts of the Middle East. Nearly 2,000 Abrams were sent to the Gulf to help force Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait. The Abrams performed excellently and was superior to the Iraqi T-55s, T-62s, and even the relatively modern T-72s that equipped Saddam's army. The Abrams were highly mobile, easy to operate, and had highly advanced command, communications, and fire control systems that enabled small numbers of Abrams to speedily maneuver, engage, and defeat many times more Soviet-model tanks at greater ranges. Hits against Iraqi armor were achieved as far as 4 kilometers away. Soviet tanks struggled to achieve half that distance. The Battle of Easting 73 was but one example of the flexible firepower that the Abrams could bring to bear. During the whole Gulf War, although some were hit by friendly fire and some had to be destroyed to prevent them falling into enemy hands, few Abrams were hit by enemy action, and none were destroyed. Of a force of nearly 2,000, only 23 were damaged or destroyed. The Abrams was clearly more than a match for Soviet-era armor. Okay, now let's talk about improvements, combat lessons, and also challenges. Modifications to the Abrams were made as a result of lessons learned during the Gulf War. Improvements were made to the fire control system and weapon sights, but the innovations kicked up several notches when the new M1A2 version of the Abrams was revealed. Development work had begun in 1988, and the first models were produced in 1992. This was a significant evolution of the Abrams platform. The tank commander now had an independent thermal viewer and a weapon station and navigation equipment. The fire control system was again upgraded. Many of the improvements involved adding more computer and data management capacity. This also meant that the internal cooling system needed to be upgraded because of the extra heat generated by the new IT systems. More combat lessons were learnt the hard way during the 2003 Second Gulf War, also known as the Iraq War, and the insurgency aftermath. Further modifications to the Abrams were made. For instance, combat identification panels were important to help reduce the risk of friendly fire incidents. There were some tank-on-tank engagements before the Saddam regime collapsed. In one incident, Abrams tanks destroyed 7 T-72s in a matter of minutes at very close range. The Iraqi tank crews were poorly trained and unable to react with sufficient speed. Having strong situational awareness and good communications is every bit as important as having thick armor and a big gun. Since the creation of the tank in 1916, all tank crews have struggled to achieve all-round ease of visibility. It's simply very difficult to see what you're doing, whether driving, firing a gun, or commanding a tank in battle, when peering out of a narrow vision slit. This has always made tanks vulnerable at night or in enclosed areas, such as forests and urban areas. Ideally, the commander sits with his head out of the turret so he can clearly see in every direction from a high position, but he is then, of course, at high risk of getting targeted by a sniper. Urban fighting in Iraq against terrorists and local militia forces caused major problems for the Abrams and the crews. The Abrams was highly vulnerable to close-up infantry creeping up on the side and rear of the vehicle, hiding in alleys and buildings. They were armed with rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank guided missiles, mines, IEDs, and even a heavy machine gun or a simple petrol bomb. At short range, many of these weapons could be sufficient to knock a tank out or damage it sufficiently in order to cause it to retire or be abandoned. You certainly do not have to destroy a tank in order to render it ineffective. Missiles were fired at tracks and wheels. Rocket-propelled grenades struck the less well-protected top and rear of the tank. Some parts of a tank are very vulnerable. Pieces of communications equipment and vision slits can be damaged and reduce the effectiveness of the tank. Even a brick can damage a radio aerial. Some Abrams had to be hastily abandoned when extra fuel stored on the outside of the tank burst into flames. This time the conflict was primarily in an urban environment and there was little opportunity for the Abrams to play to its strengths, engaging enemy vehicles at long range. The Abrams was a child of the Cold War, intended to face heavily armed threats to its front. Total losses inflicted on Abrams tanks during this second Gulf War were much more sobering to contemplate. By 2005, 80 tanks had been put out of action, of which 63 had to be returned to America for major repairs, and 17 were so damaged that they had to be written off as beyond repair. Nearly 2 years later, more than 500 Abrams had been returned to the US for repair work as a result of the combat in Iraq. In 2008, a particular Russian anti-tank rocket-propelled grenade, the RPG-29, was considered a very serious threat to the Abrams. Its innovative missile design gave it a double charge, which allowed it to first penetrate the reactive armor and then also the composite armor underneath it. In accordance with the lessons learnt in Iraq, a new modification kit was introduced, specifically designed to deal with the particular vulnerabilities that the Abrams was experiencing in the grueling city fighting. It was called Tusk, the Tank Urban Survival Kit. There was also a Tusk II kit. The Tusk program offered a series of modules and components that could be fitted to the tank or removed according to the tactical situation the crew was facing. The kits provided improved protection, extra firepower, and better situational awareness. Some of the features included add-on reactive armor, extra smoke and anti-personnel grenade discharges, transparent protection around the commander's heavy machine gun position, a thermal sight for the machine gun, 360-degree and rear-fitted cameras, and a telephone at the back of the tank to allow direct communication with the accompanying infantry. Slat armor could be added. These are forms of cages or metal grills around particularly vulnerable parts of the tank, such as the rear and crew areas. The Russians have been experimenting with these in Ukraine. But in poorly trained hands, the Abrams could be just as vulnerable as any other tank. From 2010, the Americans equipped the new Iraqi army with a vast array of combat equipment. 140 M1A1 Abrams were given to the Iraqi Defense Forces. In 2014, they were used against ISIS. However, within 3 months, over 40 of the tanks had been destroyed, damaged, or captured. At the end of 2014, the Iraqi army had only 40 Abrams tanks still operational. It's a useful reminder that the skills, training, morale, and capabilities of the crew remain at the heart of the effectiveness of the Abrams. Other packages of upgrades, separate enhancement packages (SEP), versions 1, 2, and 3, have been introduced to increase the capabilities and lifespan of the M1A1 and M1A2. The crew have received better digital maps, better interfaces, an improved cooling system, a remotely operated weapon system, and better front and side armor. But the enhancements themselves are causing problems. The weight of the tank is slowly creeping upwards. The original weight of the M1 was set at 50 tons. Enhancement packages can take the latest version of the M1A2 to well over 70 tons. There is a limit to the amount of improvements that can be made. The more weight the tank is carrying, the less mobile it will be. The more high-technology add-ons and lower-technology armor upgrades that are introduced, the more difficult, costly, and complex it becomes to service the tank. The Abrams is undeniably old, and there is no Abrams replacement yet in sight, meaning the Abrams will have to remain the US main battle tank for many more years. A study in October 2023 by the US Army Science Board concluded that the M1 Abrams would not be sufficient to support combat missions from 2040 onwards. That seems a long way away, but the Abrams is a third-generation main battle tank, and researchers and designers are now contemplating what a fifth-generation tank would look like, and urgently updating these views based on what they are learning from the war in Ukraine. At present, the view seems to be that the new tanks will need to be lighter, with a hybrid propulsion, larger guns, hypersonic missiles, and more effective passive and active protection systems. Advanced radar and sensors will make for a more and more transparent domain. It will become easier to detect weapons, see and strike targets on the battlefield. As we noted earlier, in January 2023, President Joe Biden announced that over 30 Abrams tanks would be sent to Ukraine, and that they would be the more up-to-date M1A2 versions. This sent ripples of excitement throughout the Western world and caused serious concern within the Kremlin. In late September 2023, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that all 31 had arrived. Well, first of all, we should probably take a look at the political angles that can dominate and dictate the progress of a conflict. Western countries are generally highly and actively supportive of the Ukrainian cause, but there have also been expressions of concern that Putin should not be overly provoked. This concern has changed slowly. The nature of the brutality of the Russian assault and the extensive numbers of human rights abuses has quickly become clear. Ukraine is fighting for its very existence. Billions of dollars of aid have already been sent to Ukraine. Other weapons systems have followed. Ukraine has received hundreds of armored personnel vehicles, cross-country vehicles, mobile artillery pieces, small arms ammunition, artillery shells, helmets, first aid kits. America and many EU countries have provided intelligence support and military training in a range of ways. One problem is that Ukraine is receiving so many different types of equipment from so many different countries that training, maintenance, and logistics are proving a significant challenge. However, this has been slightly alleviated by the high degree of standardization and interoperability between NATO countries, particularly regarding ammunition types. Ukraine was calling for military equipment from as soon as the conflict began in February 2022, but there was reluctance among NATO countries to hand over the most advanced NATO military hardware, such as F-16 fighter jets, main battle tanks, and long-range missiles, for fear of triggering Russian red lines and escalating the conflict. It was only well over a year after the war began that these more advanced systems began to arrive, and the quantities are still very small. 31 Abrams tanks is a relatively small amount, barely 2 American tank companies or 1 Ukrainian tank battalion. Being realistic, this is unlikely to make a significant military impact on a battlefield in which thousands of tanks are involved. So what would the strengths and weaknesses of the Abrams look like in a Ukrainian theater of war? The M1A2 and even the M1A1 with a package of upgrades would still present a very formidable opponent to the Russian armor currently being destroyed in their thousands by the Ukrainian army. Most of the tanks fielded by the Russians are upgraded versions of the same T-72 platform that the Abrams easily defeated during the Gulf War. Many are older. Other Russian tanks present, albeit in smaller numbers, are the T-80U and the T-90. The Abrams is more than a match for these vehicles, and in many ways, the Abrams has been training all its life for this battlefield confrontation. There have been many rumors that a highly capable new Russian main battle tank might be entering the Ukrainian battlefields. The T-14, seen on display during Russian victory parades for some years, was reported to be a highly advanced piece of equipment, with a 3-man crew and a remote-controlled turret, a new 125mm main armament that can fire anti-tank shells and anti-tank missiles, and carry an extensive array of very modern active defensive measures. This would have made it a 4th or even 5th generation tank, and it could have presented a very serious threat to the Abrams. But these reports seem to have been greatly exaggerated. It now seems likely that only a handful of non-battle-ready unfinished prototypes are in existence, and that the concept may never be put into full production. But let's now take a look at the battlefield environment. It's a high-intensity and high-casualty conflict, which evokes strong parallels from many parts of the last 100 years of warfare. We can see the brutal trench warfare and artillery barrages of the First World War. We can see examples of major armored, mechanized, and airborne operations that could have come straight out of the Second World War. And of course, we can see the cutting-edge technology of the most modern forms of warfare, including guided missiles, drones, electronic countermeasures, combat helicopters, and fast jets. In this mix, the main battle tank has struggled. There have certainly been many long-range instances of tank-on-tank combat, but thousands have fallen victim to artillery, cheap drones, and highly capable, man-portable anti-tank missiles. The vast array of sensors, including drones, satellites, handheld cameras, and social media, make camouflage and concealment of tanks and other armored vehicles very difficult. This combination of threats from drones, artillery, and missiles have caused many analysts to declare that the main battle tank, whether Russian, Ukrainian, or American, is now more or less obsolete. Russian tank and armored fighting vehicle losses have been absolutely staggering. United States intelligence assessments suggest that Russia may have lost 2,300 of the 3,500 tanks they have available. Cooler heads have since argued that it's far too early to make that call. Many of the Russian tank losses in particular were due to very poor offensive tactics, low morale, and a major design flaw, with the ammunition automatic loading carousel that effectively has the crew sitting right on top of the tank shells without any protection. The M1A2 would face the full array of combat challenges, just like any other main battle tank: drones, trenches, mines, artillery, anti-tank guided weapons, and guided missiles. Mines in particular have greatly reduced the mobility of all combat vehicles. Ukraine is now the most heavily mined place on Earth. On some parts of the front line, as many as 5 mines have been laid per square meter. But the Abrams is a well-designed and upgraded weapons platform that can move fast, protect the crew, and strike hard at the enemy. What would be crucial in enhancing the performance of the Abrams would be well-trained crews, solid tactics, and reliable maintenance and support. In Iraq, it was clearly demonstrated what happens if you give a top-of-the-range tank to a poorly trained crew with low morale. Giving the Abrams, or the Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 for that matter, to the Ukrainian army would also mean having to ensure that the Ukrainian tank crews, mechanics, and logisticians were also up to the correct standard in order to avoid seeing the tanks abandoned on the battlefield. So far, the Ukrainians have proven themselves highly skilled at adapting to operate many different modern American and European weapons systems, and their morale has always been high. But this does not guarantee success. Offensive combat operations in Ukraine are extremely difficult, dangerous, and costly, as both Russians and Ukrainians have found out. The Ukrainians are now quite realistic about the difficulties, particularly since their summer offensive operations were largely a disappointment, failing to drive the Russians back. America has also sent over 100 Bradley mechanized infantry combat vehicles to Ukraine, the type that accompanied Captain H.R. McMaster's Abrams tanks into the Battle of Easting 73 in 1991. The Ukrainians love them because they offer far superior protection to the crew than any equivalent ex-Soviet infantry combat vehicles could do, but as many as 24 Bradleys have been destroyed when they were used in the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive. The nature of modern warfare means that in order for a ground offensive to have a good chance of success, it needs effective air cover, accurate and responsive artillery support, and timely intelligence. It's a combination of weapon systems working together in close cooperation that wins battles. There are several pieces of American military equipment that will cause Vladimir Putin some major heart flutters. F-16 fighter jets in serious numbers would be one. Long-range guided missiles such as the US MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS, are another. In terms of frontline ground combat, Putin's greatest fear would probably be to see significant quantities of M1A2 main battle tanks, by which we mean hundreds rather than dozens, arriving in Ukraine. This would mean several things. It would mean that any political concerns about provoking Putin and the strength of the resolve of the United States government would have been resolved in Ukraine's favor. It would show a strong political lead to the rest of Europe. It would reduce issues of training and problems of compatibility if the Ukrainian main tank force was comprised of the same tank type. If several hundred Abrams arrived, it would be fair to assume that they also would come with training, maintenance, and other logistical support packages. There are thousands of Abrams M1A1 and M1A2 main battle tanks in storage in the United States. Perhaps not quite an inexhaustible supply, but now probably enough to outnumber Russian tanks on the battlefield. The arrival of M1A2 would provide the Ukrainian armed forces with a war-winning, combat-proven tank that can defeat any Russian tank on the battlefield and give Ukraine a highly capable strike force to allow it to consider serious counterattack options. The Abrams will greatly increase Ukraine's chances of military success. And that is what will keep Mr. Putin awake at night. But what do you think? Will the M1A2 be a game changer for Ukraine in the Russo-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.